Hi everyone, before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Please also stay to the end of the story for a surprise. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. The moon hovered like a silver coin in the star-flecked sky, illuminating the tall pines and oak trees that mark the border of the pack's territory. Helena stood at the edge of that domain, her thoughts swirling with anxiety and determination. Behind her lay a place she once called home, though it had never truly felt like one, and ahead of her stretched a dark forest filled with unknowns. She tightened her grip on the small canvas bag slung across her shoulder. Its contents, dried meat, a battered water flask, a spare set of clothes, and a handful of bandages, were meager compared to the dangers rumored to lurk beyond the boundary. Yet they were all she possessed. She exhaled slowly, reminding herself that she had come too far to retreat now. Only yesterday, she had stood in the pack's courtyard, listening with clenched teeth, while Alpha Carver announced that she would soon be bound to his favored beta's son, Alden. The announcement was made like a public decree, and Helena's input mattered little, as though her entire life had been condensed into a single transaction. She could still see Alden's dispassionate gaze, the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, and she could almost feel the weight of all the stares from the rest of the pack. They rarely spoke to her, except to give instructions, or to remind her that she was fortunate the Alpha had provided her with lodging after her parents' deaths. She recalled the chill that coursed through her as she stood there, grappling with the realization that if she remained, she would soon be forced into a mating bond she neither desired nor believed in. She had lost count of how many times the pack referred to her as a curse. She remembered the whispers accusing her of bringing ill luck, since rogues had attacked the night her parents died. Something about her mere existence became a taint that everyone seemed determined to keep at arm's length. In the early days, she had tried to endure it for the sake of belonging somewhere, but now she knew that no matter what she did, her future in the pack was already sealed as something oppressive and loveless. So she had spent days stealing away to corners of the compound, gathering meager supplies. She watched the guards' patrol schedules with a focus she usually reserved for her training sessions. And at last, under the cloak of darkness, she slipped away, her breath tight with fear and anticipation. Now she moved forward into the forest with cautious steps, each stride a shaky testament to her newfound resolve. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in silvered patches, and the weight of uncharted territory bore down on her shoulders. She knew the pack laws well. Do not cross the northern boundary alone. That was the place rumored to be home to rogues, wolves who had shunned, or been exiled from, organized packs. They were said to live by no rules except those their instincts dictated, forever hostile to any pack wolf they encountered. Helena's heart pounded at the thought of them prowling the woods. But even that looming threat felt less horrifying than resigning herself to a life of silent misery within the pack walls. Her first hours as a lone wolf were tense but surprisingly calm. She heard the distant hoot of owls, the scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. At some point, she paused to catch her breath by a gnarled trunk, letting her sensitive ears sweep the darkness for any sign of pursuit. The pack scouts might notice her absence by morning, or perhaps they already had. She wouldn't put it past Carver to send a search party, not out of genuine concern, but because losing her would make him look weak in the eyes of the other pack alphas. A chill breeze ruffled her hair, and she set off again, her footsteps muffled by the damp leaves underfoot. The hours passed, and the moon sank toward the horizon, giving way to the faint glimmer of dawn. Helena's mind wandered back to her childhood before the tragedy that took her parents, She remembered her father teaching her simple survival skills, how to snare rabbits, how to recognize which plants were safe to eat, and how to hold a blade properly. Those memories stood in stark contrast to how the pack treated her after his death, yet in a bittersweet twist, those lessons now formed the core of her ability to survive alone. With every step, she was determined to prove she could make it without the pack. She was determined to show that the outcast could fend for herself, free from the stifling scorn that had ruled her life. It was near dawn when she decided she needed to rest. She spotted an overgrown thicket by a narrow stream, its branches woven thick enough to provide camouflage. After crawling inside, she sipped from her flask and chewed a strip of the dried meat. Exhaustion made her eyelids heavy, and she allowed them to close, taking comfort in the soft gurgling of the water. That soothing lullaby was enough for her to slip into a shallow sleep, one tinged with uneasy dreams of glowing eyes and howls echoing through the night. She woke with a start some hours later, the sun shining in thin rays through the twisted branches, warming her cheeks. Disoriented, she listened for any noises out of place. A squirrel chattered overhead, a breeze rustled the leaves, but there was no sign of patrols or approaching wolves. Relieved, she collected her things and set out once more, pushing deeper into the unclaimed forest. The terrain grew more rugged as she wove around rocky outcrops and navigated dense clusters of pines. She kept her senses sharp for any unusual sound or scent, aware that her presence in rogue territory would make her a target for those who guarded their freedom jealously. As the sun reached its zenith, sweat beaded on her forehead. She came across a small clearing where the forest canopy parted, allowing a brilliant shaft of sunlight to illuminate the grass. She paused there, her gaze dancing over the wildflowers that dotted the ground. For a moment, she considered how peaceful it all seemed, how far removed from the turmoil of the pack. A tiny ember of hope flickered in her heart at the thought that perhaps she really could survive on her own, forging a solitary path in this lonely terrain. But that fragile optimism shattered when she sensed something off. The hush fell over the clearing like a heavy curtain. Her wolf instinct screamed that eyes were upon her. She spun around, scanning the edges of the clearing where the trees cast long shadows. At first, she saw only stillness, but then a faint movement caught her eye. A tall figure stepped from between two massive trunks, moving with the deadly grace of a predator. A man, though Helena's instincts immediately told her he was also a wolf. Even at a distance, she felt the power in his stance, the quiet confidence that bespoke immense strength. His eyes were a striking shade of gold, so intense that she wondered if they glowed from within. Dark hair fell across his brow in disheveled locks, and he wore battered clothes that seemed to have survived countless fights. Her heartbeat thundered. She recalled the pack's warnings about a certain rogue alpha rumored to be as strong as any pack leader, if not stronger. Some called him unstoppable, savage, and impossible to tame. She didn't know if this was that same wolf, but something in the tilt of his chin and the heat of his gaze made her believe he was. She stood rooted to the spot, gripping the strap of her bag as if it could shield her. Neither of them spoke for several heartbeats. The forest stilled as though caught in the tension of this first encounter. He was the one who finally broke the silence. "You smell of pack," he remarked, his voice a low rumble that sent alarm bells ringing in Helena's mind. "Yet you walk here alone." Helena inhaled, forcing herself to stay composed. "I left them," she managed, voice trembling only slightly. "I have no quarrel with any rogues. I'm just passing through." She tried to project an air of calm determination, though her heart drummed frantically. His gaze traveled over her, a curious glint lighting those golden eyes. He inched closer, stepped silent on the grass. Few would dare come here alone, and fewer still would stand their ground when confronted by a stranger. Either you're reckless or desperate. Which is it? His tone carried a quiet menace, but also a faint undercurrent of interest. She lifted her chin, trying to find her courage. Maybe a bit of both, she said, though inside, every instinct screamed at her to be careful. I've been living under scorn and ridicule for too long. My pack was about to force me into a mating bond I didn't want. She let the words tumble out, almost surprised that she was admitting so much. I had no choice but to run. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she realized that behind that fierce exterior, he was listening closely. Forced bonding, he muttered, the faintest hint of distaste curling the corner of his lips. And your alpha allowed it, she nodded, stifling the bitterness in her chest. He decreed it, actually. He seemed to mull her words over for a moment, then took another measured step toward her. You do realize that rogues won't grant you the kindness your pack withheld. Out here, everything is a battle for territory, resources, and sometimes just for the thrill of violence. If you're trying to escape cruelty, you may have picked the wrong direction. She swallowed, steeling herself. And yet I'd rather face that than be shackled to a loveless bond for the rest of my life. The moment she said it, she felt a flush of emotions, anger, sorrow, defiance, surge through her. She braced for him to sneer or to laugh at her naivete. Instead, he inclined his head slightly, the motion almost respectful. Bravery or folly, he murmured. We'll see which it is. Another quiet interval passed before he introduced himself, voice low and resonant. My name is Ronan. It took a second for Helena to reply, as the name echoed in her mind. She had heard it whispered among pack soldiers who claimed a rogue by that name had taken down entire patrols. I'm Helena, she said at last, feeling strangely relieved to offer her name. I don't mean to intrude on your land. Ronan watched her carefully, as though searching her words for hidden motives. If you have no quarrel with me, then I might let you leave. Something flickered in his expression, like a passing thought he had yet to fully grasp. He gave her another once-over, causing a strange tingle to trace down her spine. You want to move quickly. The forest is large, but rumors travel fast. If you continue north, you'll find yourself deeper in rogue territory. Some are savage, some are not, but all will challenge you the moment. They sense weakness. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with the realization that she hadn't planned this far ahead. In truth, she had left the pack in a storm of emotion, focusing only on crossing the border and not on the intricate dangers that lay beyond. A quiet panic bubbled within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'll manage, she said, hoping her voice didn't betray the uncertainty that churned in her belly. Ronan's gaze lingered on her face, his expression inscrutable. Then, with fluid grace, he turned and slipped back among the trees, vanishing into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. Helena stood rooted for a long moment, heart pounding, uncertain whether she should be relieved or unnerved. That short exchange had revealed a wolf who possessed more than just a brute's strength. There was intelligence and self-control in the way he spoke, as though he had chosen to walk away for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. Eventually, she roused herself from her stupor and continued on. She had only traveled a short distance when her keen ears picked up a rustling in the undergrowth behind her. Her senses went on high alert, and she spun around, expecting to see Ronan. Instead, a pair of feral eyes glinted at the forest's edge. Another rogue, this one already in wolf form. Before she could fully register the threat, it lunged. Helena barely managed to leap aside, her heart hammering as adrenaline flooded her veins. She drew the hunting knife from her belt, clumsy with fear. The wolf circled her, growling. She saw foam flecking its muzzle, and her stomach tightened. Something about its posture, its ragged fur, spoke of desperation or a twisted mind. She had been taught how to fight, but always under structured rules and with a partner who pulled their punches. This was nothing like those training sessions. The rogue rushed again, jaws snapping, and she slashed wildly, her blade scraping across its flank. It howled in pain and fury. Panic threatened to consume her as she realized she might have to kill or be killed. She tried to pivot around a large rock to keep distance, but the wolf was quick, and before she knew it, it had lunged again, knocking her onto her back. Sharp fangs gnashed inches from her face. She shoved her forearm against its throat to keep those teeth at bay, but it thrashed violently, too strong to hold off for long. Just when she thought she felt the wolf's hot breath closing on her flesh, a fierce growl reverberated across the clearing. A dark shape slammed into the rogue, ripping it away from her. Helena scrambled upright, panting, her pulse roaring in her ears. She looked up to see Ronan in wolf form, towering and muscled, his dark fur bristling. He sank his teeth into the rogue's shoulder, forcing it down with savage efficiency. The rogue let out a pained yelp, struggling desperately, but Ronan's hold was unyielding. With a brutal shake, he flung the rogue aside. Whimpering, the injured wolf staggered to its feet and fled into the forest. Helena sank to her knees, trembling. She pressed a hand against her racing heart and tried to slow her breath. Ronan's wolf stood there, breath ragged, golden eyes fixed on her. Slowly, he shifted back, bones and muscles reforming, until he stood in his human shape again, streaks of blood staining his arms. Helena's gaze flicked from his broad chest up to his face, and she found his expression grim. "You'd be dead if I hadn't come back," he said, voice taut. "Next time, don't give an enemy the chance to pin you." She swallowed, pulling herself together. "Aye?" She paused, realizing how pathetic she must look. Her clothes were torn and smeared with dirt, and her hand still shook around the knife hilt. "Thank you. I should have been more alert." Ronan nodded, eyes narrowing. "Why didn't you shift? You're a wolf, are you not?" She looked away, shame spiraling within her. "I panicked. I'm not used to fighting alone, and by the time I realized I should shift, it was too late." She grimaced, remembering the biting scorn from her old trainers who insisted she lacked a killer instinct. He grunted, kneeling down next to her to check if she was hurt. "You're not bleeding," he observed, although a livid bruise was already forming on her forearm. "It could have been worse." A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Seems like my entire life has been a string of it could have been worse." She wiped sweat from her brow, still trying to calm her jittery nerves. She remembered the stories of how savage rogues would kill without hesitation, and in this single encounter, she realized just how unprepared she was. Ronan exhaled, a trace of frustration in the set of his jaw. "If you intend to keep moving through this territory, you need to learn to defend yourself properly. Otherwise, the next time you face a rogue like that, you won't survive." He stood, scanning the trees, every muscle in his body still coiled with tension. "If you keep heading north, you'll run into more, and not all will be as weak or deranged as that one." She got to her feet, biting back a flare of defensive pride. "I've trained. I'm not—" Her voice trailed off when she realized she sounded like a child protesting a scolding. She took a deeper breath and began again. "I've trained with the pack, but it's different out here. No one taught me how to handle real life-or-death fights alone." Ronan studied her for a silent moment, his golden eyes assessing. At length he shook his head, almost as though he were making a decision he didn't entirely like. "Then I'll teach you, at least enough so that you don't die." It was not a gentle offer. It came out more like an ultimatum, and Helena wasn't sure how to react. Why would a rogue alpha, if he truly was one, take it upon himself to train a fleeing pack wolf? She felt the prick of suspicion. "Why would you help me at all?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "We just met, and we're essentially enemies by default." His lips tightened. "I have my reasons," he said curtly. "Part of it is that I don't want every half-starved rogue in these woods thinking they can wander onto my territory and claim it. You're a novelty here, and that could stir trouble. It's simpler for me if you know how to handle yourself and then move on." He spoke with a bluntness that left no room for argument, and beneath the practical explanation, Helena sensed there was more to his decision. However, she was in no position to pry, and she had no illusions that she could handle further attacks unaided. She nodded, warily accepting his help. "All right, but this doesn't mean I'm pledging loyalty to you or anything like that." The last thing she wanted was to jump from one dominating authority figure to another. She had just escaped forced subjugation. An almost amused look flickered across Ronan's face. "I wouldn't want that," he said, a faint derisive edge to his tone. "I don't take pack wolves under my wing." He turned, gesturing for her to follow, and Helena stifled the flutter in her stomach. As stern and forbidding as he was, he had leapt to her defense without hesitation. And there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a silent intensity she couldn't name, something that made her pulse beat a fraction faster whenever he looked at her. They hiked for another hour, weaving through thick undergrowth until they reached a natural clearing beside a mossy outcrop of stone. A shallow creek trickled nearby, providing fresh water. Ronan scanned the perimeter. "We'll stay here for a short while," he announced. "Long enough for me to show you some basics of fighting a rogue in wolf form." Helena set down her bag, realizing how exhausted she was from the near-death encounter and the lack of proper rest. "Fine," she said, her voice betraying more relief than she intended. She remembered the way her parents used to coach her in small bursts of training, always reminding her that a quick mind and fluid movement were more important than brute force. She felt a pang of sadness at how much she missed them. If they were still alive, maybe she would not be in this situation. Maybe the pack wouldn't have cast her as an outcast, but she couldn't change the past. All she could do was learn how to survive right now. Ronan's lessons were as ruthless as she expected. He insisted on a quick demonstration of her wolf form, and Helena reluctantly stripped behind a large tree, shifting into her lean gray wolf. She braced herself for some sign of mockery in his eyes, but he simply observed her with a critical focus, circling her with the air of a hunter sizing up prey or a mentor evaluating a student. He nodded once, then shifted himself, the transformation rippling through him quickly. If Helena's wolf was lean and swift, Ronan's was the essence of raw power. Dark fur, hulking muscles, and a presence that made her instincts want to submit. She swallowed back a wave of intimidation and forced herself to bare her fangs. Ronan lunged at her without warning, teeth flashing, and she narrowly dodged. He was teaching her through real combat, making her rely on instinct and reflex. Her heart thundered, but a surge of determination flared within her. She had spent years being dismissed by her old pack. She refused to let fear shackle her again. She spun, snapping at him with surprising agility. He evaded her easily, but a flicker of approval gleamed in his eyes. He pushed her to the edge of her stamina, attacking in quick bursts, forcing her to adapt or be slammed to the ground. Each time she started to waver, he let up for just a moment, then came at her again. The exercise seemed endless, and Helena's muscles burned, but something inside her stirred to life, a spark of fierce will that she had never truly tapped before. She used her smaller frame to her advantage, slipping under his bigger wolf form and snapping at his flanks. He growled, feinting to the left, then barreling her to the right. She rolled on the ground, sprang back to her paws, and attacked again. Gradually, she began to anticipate his moves. When he finally called a halt, both of them were panting, sides heaving. Helena's fur was matted with sweat, and she lay down on the grass, trying to catch her breath. Ronan shifted back first, crossing the clearing to retrieve his clothes. Helena followed suit, dressing hastily, aware of the slight trembling in her limbs. Exhaustion dragged at her, but there was a thrill beneath the fatigue. She had glimpsed a shred of her own strength, a glimpse that told her maybe she was no longer the helpless outcast who needed saving. After they were both dressed, Ronan offered her a skin of water. She accepted it, gulping down mouthfuls. The water was deliciously cold, soothing her raw throat. "You learn quickly," he noted, "but you still hesitate in the moment you switch from defense to offense." She wiped sweat from her brow, giving a short nod. "I'm not used to turning aggression on someone else unless I'm told it's safe. The pack always had so many rules about training, it was always a carefully staged fight." He folded his arms across his chest, studying her. "Out here, you hesitate, and you die." His words were blunt, but not unkind. "I'm showing you as much as I can, but real rogues won't hold back. They'll exploit every weakness." She forced a wry smile. "I gathered that, thanks." A silence settled over them. Helena noticed again the faint scars crisscrossing Ronan's arms and collarbone. She wondered how he'd gotten them. Fights with other rogues, perhaps, or maybe from the time he had belonged to a pack, if he ever had. Curiosity burned in her, yet she was reluctant to overstep. The last thing she wanted was to provoke him by asking too many personal questions. They spent the remainder of the day honing her reflexes. Ronan insisted she shift to wolf form again and again, pressing her to practice quick transformations so she could adapt the moment a threat appeared. Each shift was a draining process, but Helena understood the necessity. If she froze in human form at the wrong instant, she would stand no chance against a savage wolf attack. By the time twilight wrapped the clearing in a dusky glow, her body ached, and she collapsed by the creek, splashing cool water on her face. Ronan kept watch a short distance away, quiet and alert. She marveled at his resilience, how he seemed almost tireless, though she caught him occasionally rolling his shoulder or stretching out a stiff leg. Even he had limits, it seemed. As night fell, they made a small fire, careful to keep it hidden behind a ring of stones. Helena roasted some of her dried meat, while Ronan sniffed at the air as though searching for game. When she offered him a share of her meager meal, he shrugged noncommittally, but eventually took a portion. She watched him eat in silence, the flicker of flames casting shadows across his face. There was a tempest of questions swirling in her mind: who he really was, how he had come to control a section of rogue territory, and why he was helping her at all. But a weariness settled into her bones. As she found herself drifting closer to the fire, lulled by the promise of sleep, she awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling leaves. Ronan was on his feet, scanning the darkness with the intensity of a predator. Her heart lurched, and she rose too, ready to shift if danger approached. But after several tense moments, it became clear that whatever had lurked in the darkness was gone. Ronan turned, casting her a glance. "Go back to sleep," he said quietly. I'll keep watch." She swallowed, nodding. Even in the gloom, his eyes glinted gold, reflecting the embers of the dying fire. She felt a strange comfort in his presence, contradictory though it was. He was a rogue, and unknown, but he also felt like a barrier standing between her and the terrors of the night. She settled back onto the ground, draping her thin blanket around her shoulders, letting the rhythmic pulse of her heartbeat guide her back into slumber. When the first pale rays of dawn broke through the canopy, Helena sat up to find Ronan perched on a fallen log, arms resting on his knees. He had not slept, or if he had, it was only in brief intervals. In the soft morning light, his features seemed marginally less severe, though she doubted he would appreciate being told that. She roused herself and rinsed her face in the creek, grateful for the crisp feel of the water against her skin. The routine of survival had already begun to settle over them, and she found it odd how quickly she could adapt to this life after spending so many years in the rigid structure of the pack. Ronan inhaled deeply, as though tasting the morning air. "We'll spar again soon, but first you need to eat," he said. "Food is scarce in these woods." "We might have to hunt. Together?" she asked, raising a brow. A slight smirk crossed his lips. "You'll need to learn that too, but I won't let you slow me down if you don't know what you're doing. It's easier for me to go alone at first." She bristled slightly at the notion of being dismissed. "I can track rabbits. It was one of the few skills my father taught me before." She paused, not wanting to delve into details about her parents' deaths. Ronan tilted his head, curiosity lighting his eyes for a split second. "Fine. Let's see what you can do." Without further ado, he led her into the woods, gliding between the pines with a stealth that left her scrambling to keep up quietly. Helena focused on placing her feet carefully, recalling her father's lessons about reading the forest floor for signs of disturbed foliage or droppings. The hush of the woods seemed absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the branches and the occasional distant call of a bird. They eventually found fresher tracks, small prints pressed into a patch of muddy ground near a narrow stream. Helena dropped into a crouch, gesturing to Ronan to show that they were getting close to a potential warren. He observed the tracks, then nodded approvingly, and motioned for her to circle around. She did so, slow and deliberate, using clumps of fern for cover. Carefully, she lifted her head to peer over a fallen log. Her heart did a tiny flip when she saw 2 rabbits nibbling at the grass, ears twitching, unsuspecting of predators nearby. A swirl of excitement gripped her. She had not been on a proper hunt in a long time. In her old pack, hunting was often a group activity, and outcasts like her rarely received official invitations. She had learned more from books, stories, and stolen moments of practice. Now, it was all on her. She signaled to Ronan, then in a single movement, she lunged forward, shifting seamlessly into her wolf form mid-leap. The rabbits scattered, but she was quick. Claws dug into the earth, and her jaws snapped around one of the frantic creatures, ending its flight with swift finality. Panting, Helena let the rabbit's limp form drop from her muzzle. Her chest heaved as she looked around, adrenaline flooding her senses. She spotted Ronan in his wolf form as well, emerging from the brush. He carried the other rabbit in his jaws. He trotted closer, and for a moment, they simply regarded each other. Helena felt an odd sense of shared triumph and closeness in that moment, like they were 2 halves of a single hunting team. Then he shifted back first, placing the rabbit on the ground, and she followed suit. He examined her catch. "You're not completely incompetent," he acknowledged, his tone almost wry. "Could use more stealth, but it worked." A tiny flush of pride warmed her cheeks. "I managed," she said lightly. They prepared the rabbits over a small, quickly built fire, and the savory smell of roasting meat filled the air. Helena's stomach growled, a reminder of how little real food she had eaten since fleeing the pack. While the meat cooked, they shared a companionable silence. She watched Ronan from the corner of her eye, the way he tested the air for any danger, the slight tension in his posture that never fully eased. He seemed completely at home in these woods, as though the wild tang of pine and loam were as essential to him as breath itself. When the meat was ready, they ate quickly, mindful of the smoke that could attract unwelcome visitors. The taste was simple but satisfying, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Helena felt a modest sense of accomplishment. If she could learn from Ronan, then perhaps she would stand a chance of surviving alone. They returned to their makeshift camp to find it undisturbed. As Helena rinsed her hands in the creek, she remembered the savage rogue that nearly killed her. Her gaze flicked to Ronan, who was crouched by the fire pit, raking dirt over the ashes to extinguish them. "What do we do if it comes back?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "We kill it," he replied, voice devoid of emotion. "I gave it a chance to run. If it's foolish enough to return, it deserves no mercy." Helena nodded, feeling a pang of disquiet at how easily he spoke of taking another life. Then again, she supposed that was the reality of living as a rogue. There was no safety net of pack alliances or treaties. You survived by your own strength. Her next thought was more unsettling. How had he become so used to this existence? She wondered if he had been cast out of a pack, or if he had walked away by choice, the way she had. She opened her mouth to ask, but before she could, Ronan rose to his feet, giving her a pointed look. "Time for another training session," he declared, effectively cutting off her curiosity. She swallowed her questions and steeled herself for another grueling round of sparring, determined not to disappoint him or, more importantly, herself. They spent the next days in a relentless cycle of training, hunting, and vigilant watch. Ronan continued to hammer her weaknesses, making her shift in and out of wolf form until her entire body felt like it was aflame with fatigue. Through it all, Helena sensed a subtle shift in the air between them, a growing tension that was neither hostile nor entirely comfortable. She sometimes caught him observing her with an unreadable expression, as though deciphering a puzzle he had never encountered. Each time she tried to meet his gaze, her wolf stirred inside her chest, conflicted between fear and an odd yearning. Late one afternoon, while they rested under the canopy of a massive oak after an intense sparring session, Helena mustered the courage to broach the subject that had been circling her mind. "Why do you stay here alone?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "Most wolves, rogue or not, tend to form small groups or alliances." He glanced at her, taking a moment before replying. "I have my reasons," he said, echoing his earlier refusal to elaborate. "Groups become packs sooner or later, and I'm not interested in that." She pressed her lips together, stifling her frustration. "It must get lonely," she said softly, picking her words with caution. "I felt alone most of my life, even when I was surrounded by my pack, but at least there were voices, people, or maybe that's worse than being truly alone." Ronan's gaze flicked over her. For a moment she thought he might open up, but his eyes turned distant. "Solitude doesn't bother me," he said finally. "It's simpler." She dropped the subject, not wanting to push him. But the unsettled feeling remained, a suspicion that beneath that hardened exterior lay a story he was determined not to share. She told herself it didn't matter, he was training her out of necessity, and once she could stand on her own, she would leave. Yet she couldn't ignore the tension that surfaced whenever they were close, like when they practiced grapples in human form, and his hands gripped her arms with startling intensity. A strange flutter would ignite in her stomach, unbidden, and she sensed that he felt it too. It was as if some primal part of her recognized him in a way she could not rationally explain. That night, as she drifted off to sleep by the dim embers of the fire, she recalled how easily Ronan had saved her from the rogue's attack. She thought of the times he had shown subtle kindness, offering water, a spare fur to sleep on, a tidbit of advice meant to keep her alive. Despite his brusque manner, there was something almost protective in how he moved around her, as though he had taken on the role of guardian, whether or not he truly desired it. Her final thought before slumber claimed her was an uneasy realization. Whatever bond or tension was growing between them, it defied logic, and it might well prove as dangerous as any rogue lurking in the forest. Morning found her sprawled near the remnants of the fire, the smell of wood smoke clinging to her clothes. She blinked awake, glancing around to find Ronan already gone. Unease curled in her gut. He wouldn't just vanish without a word, would he? But then she spotted him returning through the trees, carrying 2 plump rabbits by the ears. It seemed he had decided to hunt alone at first light. Relief mingled with a strange delight in her chest, though she tried to mask it as he approached. He tossed the rabbits onto the ground. "Get a fire going," he instructed. "We'll eat, then we move. I don't like staying in one spot too long." She obediently gathered kindling, using a flint to spark the fire to life. She tried not to dwell on how neatly they had fallen into a routine of cooperation. While the rabbits cooked, she asked, "Where do you plan on going?" Ronan knelt beside her. "Deeper into the forest," he said, "away from the eastern boundaries. The pack might send trackers if they're intent on finding you." Helena stiffened. She had half forgotten that possibility in the midst of her training. "My departure might have caused a scandal, but I'm not important to them," she said, though doubt nibbled at her. "Then again, Carver's pride might push him to send a search party. He hates looking incompetent in front of his allies." Ronan glanced at her. "Pride is dangerous. He might consider your flight a challenge to his authority. And if he finds out you're with a rogue, he won't hesitate to send a large force. You a part of his pack. You'd know better than me how far he's willing to go." Helena grimaced, recalling the Alpha's harsh demeanor. "I wouldn't put anything past him. But let's hope he decides it's not worth the effort." She gazed into the flames, her thoughts drifting to the beta's son she was supposed to mate. She felt a flicker of guilt for leaving without warning, but that guilt was overshadowed by relief. She remembered the emptiness in Alden's eyes whenever he looked at her. There was no warmth there, no genuine interest. He was just following an order. No, she couldn't have lived that life, trapped in a bond with someone whose heart was as cold as winter's breath. Once the rabbits were cooked, they ate quickly, then doused the fire. Ronan led the way, forging a path deeper into the untamed forest. The foliage grew denser, vines twisting around thick trunks and blocking out most of the sunlight. They passed ancient trees draped with moss, and the sound of running water echoed in the distance. Every so often, Ronan would pause, tilt his head, and sniff the breeze, scanning for danger. Helena followed his lead, trying to emulate his alertness, practicing the skills he had drilled into her. Though the day was uneventful, Helena's nerves prickled, as if the forest held its breath. By the time twilight colored the sky with purple and orange hues, they settled in a new spot near a craggy rock face, where a small waterfall spilled into a pool below. The constant rush of water provided cover for any small noises they might make. Ronan pointed out natural choke points and vantage spots, explaining how they could defend themselves if attacked. Helena listened intently, absorbing his tactical knowledge like a sponge. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of confidence, a sense that she might not be so easily overwhelmed if trouble came. They prepared for another night beneath the open sky. Helena set up a makeshift bedding area of layered foliage and a thin blanket from her pack. Ronan, as usual, seemed content to remain on the outer perimeter, keeping watch. The unspoken routine was that she would get some rest, and he would stay vigilant until exhaustion forced him to sleep, often just before dawn. She admired his dedication, though she worried about how little he seemed to sleep. She guessed it was a habit, perhaps one shaped by years of expecting attacks in the night. While darkness settled, Helena drifted in and out of a restless doze. She dreamed of her old pack, of standing alone in the courtyard as Carver's voice echoed off the stone walls, and then she saw Ronan in the distance, eyes gleaming gold, calling her name. She woke with a start, realizing she was shivering. She sat up, scanning the darkness. The waterfall's roar was steady, and the moonlight caught the sparkle of mist in the air. She rose and carefully navigated the rocks until she spotted Ronan at the edge of the pool, gazing into the night sky. Moonlight traced the contours of his features, revealing wariness carved into his face. The hush between them was profound, broken only by the distant rush of water. Slowly, Helena approached, her voice soft when she spoke. "You can rest, you know. I can keep watch for a while." He turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. For a moment he didn't reply, as though he was weighing how much to reveal. At last he shook his head. "I'm used to it," he said simply. "Sleep doesn't always come easily for me." She studied him, thinking she detected a hollow note in his voice. For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, she felt drawn to comfort him. "It doesn't come easily for me either," she admitted. "I usually dream about the night my parents were killed by rogues. After that, I was blamed for bringing bad luck, so every night I'd brace myself for more accusations. Even when I slept, I never truly rested." His gaze flickered with empathy, or something close to it. "The pack turned on you because of that?" She nodded. "They said I was a magnet for misfortune, though no one dared to say it outright in front of the Alpha. But it became this invisible barrier between me and everyone else. It only got worse after Carver rose to power. He never did like me. So he didn't bother silencing the rumors." Ronan's jaw tightened, and he exhaled in a low hiss. "So they cast you out socially, then tried to bind you to someone for political gain. Typical pack nonsense." She couldn't help a tiny laugh at the bluntness of his remark. "You really do hate packs, don't you?" A faint smirk tugged at his lips. "I've seen enough of them to know they can be just as cruel as rogues, only they hide it behind rules and titles. At least rogues don't pretend to be righteous when they hunt you. They shared a moment of mutual understanding, each weighed down by experiences of betrayal and loss." Helena looked up at the moon, tracing the patterns of stars. If she hadn't left, she would be trapped in that oppressive cycle of scorn and duty. Instead, she was standing here, with a rogue who, despite his guarded exterior, had saved her life and taught her how to fight. The forest around them whispered with night sounds, an orchestra of nocturnal creatures that seemed oddly serene compared to the turmoil in her heart. She took a breath, summoning courage. "Ronan, you mentioned once that you don't keep alliances. But what if you didn't have to? Not forever, but maybe just call." Her words faltered as she tried to express the swirl of emotion inside her. She wasn't asking him to form a pack with her. She doubted that was even possible. But loneliness clutched at her, and the idea of parting ways once she was strong enough to survive on her own felt strangely painful. He hesitated, understanding the undertone of her question. His golden eyes softened by a fraction. "I've been alone for a reason," he said quietly. "It's safer, less complicated." She bristled, a surge of defiance welling up. Life isn't just about safety. Sometimes we need people, even if it risks pain. The words escaped before she could fully consider them, revealing a vulnerability she usually kept locked away. He regarded her as if trying to decipher her meaning. The hush between them was thick with unspoken tension. She thought she saw him waver, a flicker of conflicted emotion crossing his face. Then, with the abruptness of a door slamming shut, his expression went stony. "I won't promise anything," he said, voice quiet but firm. "You have your path to walk, and I have mine." She nodded, swallowing her disappointment. She told herself she had no right to expect anything else. She was a fugitive pack wolf. He was a rogue with his own burdens. Perhaps the fleeting connection she sensed was nothing more than the illusion of two lonely souls thrown together by chance. With a heavy heart, she murmured good night and turned to head back toward the campfire. She felt the weight of his gaze on her back as she walked away, and every step seemed to echo with a question that neither of them knew how to answer. 2 days later, Helena found herself knee-deep in a murky stretch of marshland, cursing under her breath as she tried to free her boot from the thick mud that clung to it like glue. The forest had changed terrain dramatically, shifting from pine-laden hills to boggy lowlands, and the air hung heavy with moisture. Her hair stuck to her neck, and insects buzzed around her ears. Not exactly the most pleasant environment, but Ronan insisted on leading her through this route to avoid potential run-ins with more aggressive rogues. Or, worse, a pack scouting party. She gripped a sturdy stick and used it for balance, managing to pull her foot free. "Ah," she grumbled. "Is this really better than risking a fight on solid ground?" Ronan, who stood on a slightly drier patch, studied the map of the wetlands in his mind before nodding curtly. "Yes, trust me. No one who doesn't know these paths will want to venture here. We'll have an advantage if we need to defend ourselves." He glanced at her. "If you're tired, say so. We can rest in a bit." She set her jaw. "I'm fine," she said, refusing to show weakness. She'd come a long way since the day he first found her. Her reflexes had sharpened, her confidence grown, and she now carried herself with more assurance. Yet, a lingering worry gnawed at her that the pack might still be hunting for her. She didn't imagine Carver would invest resources forever, but she couldn't forget the potential humiliation her escape might cause him. They trudged on, pushing aside hanging moss and wading through ankle-deep water. Frogs croaked, and dragonflies flitted across the surface in bright flashes of color. After a time, they reached drier ground near a twisted willow tree that loomed over the marsh. Ronan motioned for her to stop, scanning the area with a keen eye. Satisfied it was safe, he set down his pack. "We'll rest here," he announced. Helena collapsed onto a mossy patch of earth, stretching her sore legs. The thick canopy of branches provided shade from the sun, though the humidity was still relentless. She dug into her bag and pulled out a flask of water, drinking deeply. Every muscle in her body ached from days of constant vigilance. Still, she found a strange sense of satisfaction in it. She was surviving, learning new skills every day, and the memory of being labeled an outcast within the pack was beginning to feel distant. Ronan settled himself on a log, rummaging through his pack. "We need to restock our supplies soon," he said, pulling out a small portion of dried meat. "The rabbits we've caught won't last more than another day or two." Hunting in the marsh is going to be tricky. She nodded, flicking a mosquito away from her ear. Then let's move on quickly tomorrow and find higher ground. I'd rather hunt on firmer soil. She hesitated, then added, unless you think it's too risky. He chewed on his dried meat thoughtfully. It might be, but we can't starve. I know a place not far from here, an old abandoned structure that might give us shelter for a night or two while we hunt. She raised her brows, intrigued. An abandoned structure? You mean like a cabin? He shrugged. More of a crumbling watchtower from some old territory war. I've seen it a couple of times. It's tucked into the forest near the far side of this marsh. His expression darkened briefly, as though recalling memories associated with that place. Not many venture there, so it should be safe. Helena couldn't help a slight surge of curiosity. She wondered if it was wise to take refuge in a man-made structure. Then again, any walls would be better than no walls if they were ambushed. Let's do it, she said, mustering her resolve. They finished their meager meal, then set about searching for edible plants in the marsh's drier outskirts. Helena moved carefully, mindful of potential sinkholes or hidden pools. She recalled the horror stories of wolves vanishing into quicksand-like mud or tangling with venomous reptiles that occasionally lurked in such environments. Her caution proved beneficial. She managed to spot a cluster of edible reeds and a couple of mushrooms that Ronan identified as safe enough to eat once cooked. By the time dusk settled, they returned to the willow tree with a modest but useful collection of additional food. That evening, they ate sparingly, planning to save their rations for the journey to the watchtower the next day. The night hummed with insect chatter, a continuous background of chirps and buzzes that filled the damp air. Ronan built a small fire to ward off mosquitoes, and they sat on either side of it, the flames flickering across their faces. Helena leaned back against a log, exhaustion from slogging through the marsh seeping into her bones. She let her gaze wander to Ronan, noticing how he stared into the flames, but distant look in his eyes. For a moment, she debated asking him again about his past, but the weight of his earlier refusals held her back. Instead, she offered him a slight smile when he glanced her way. She turned her thoughts to the future, trying to imagine what it would mean to truly live as a rogue on her own. Would she spend the rest of her days roaming from one territory to another, scraping by? The notion was daunting, but it beat being shackled to Alden under Carver's decree. She clung to that thought, reminding herself how far she had already come. Eventually, she laid out a small bedroll and settled down. Ronan assumed his usual place on watch, perched on a thick root that jutted from the ground. She envied his stamina, but she also noticed the subtle signs of wear in his posture. He hadn't truly rested much since they met. Even as she drifted into a light sleep, she felt a pang of concern for him, which was strange, considering that only a short time ago she had been terrified of him. Now, worry threaded through her dreams. At some point during the night, something jostled her out of a hazy slumber. She sat up, senses alert. The fire had burned low, and the marsh lay shrouded in darkness. She heard a faint growl from Ronan's position, and her pulse spiked as she rose to her feet. Heart pounding, she peered through the gloom, straining to see what had triggered his alarm. A shape emerged from behind a cluster of reeds, a wolf, eyes glinting in the dim embers. Its fur was shaggy and unkempt, its stance tense. Ronan stepped forward, a warning growl thrumming in his chest. Helena's hand crept to her dagger. The intruder's nose twitched as it sniffed the air, probably catching the scent of both of them. Its lips curled back in a snarl, but it didn't immediately attack. Instead, it crept sideways, assessing them, perhaps deciding if it had the advantage. Ronan's posture made it clear he would fight to the death if provoked. Helena tried to gauge whether this newcomer was alone. The marsh made it hard to hear if there were others lurking. She could sense no other shapes in the immediate area, but that didn't mean none were hidden nearby. Swallowing, she spoke softly. "We don't want trouble," she said, though she wondered if the rogue understood or cared. The shaggy wolf responded with a sharper snarl, baring yellowed fangs. Its eyes flicked to Helena, then back to Ronan, as though it recognized which of them posed the bigger threat. The tension hung in the muggy air, palpable as a physical weight. Ronan bared his own teeth in reply, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on Helena's arms stand on end. She had seen him fight before, and knew how quickly he could transform into a merciless force. For an agonizing moment, the intruder stood poised for attack. Then, with a short huff, it turned and slunk back into the darkness, disappearing into the tall reeds. Helena's heart slammed against her ribs, adrenaline still coursing through her. She scanned the surroundings, unsure if it was a ruse, but after a few long minutes, there was no further movement. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Ronan didn't move from his spot for a while, still alert. Finally, he relaxed a fraction, turning to her. "You all right?" She gave a shaky nod. "Yes, it just left." His expression was grim. It probably realized it couldn't win. Maybe it was scouting or just hungry and desperate. Either way, we should stay vigilant. We'll leave this place at first light. Helena swallowed, nodding in agreement. She crawled back to her bedroll, though any hope of restful sleep was gone. She dozed in fits and starts, half expecting another growl or a sudden attack. Ronan remained upright, scanning the marsh like a sentinel. The long hours dragged, and she felt the tension coil in her muscles. She thought about how often he had saved her from harm, or how many times he had stood guard while she slept. A flicker of gratitude warmed her heart despite the grim circumstances. She owed him her life more than once now. When dawn arrived, they swiftly gathered their gear, wanting to leave the marsh behind. The atmosphere felt heavy with unseen dangers, and Helena was relieved when the ground began to slope upward, becoming firmer beneath her boots. The transition was gradual, and soon tall pines replaced the twisted willow trees. The boggy smell gave way to a crisp pine scent, and the air, though still humid, felt cleaner. The sound of birds returned, a sign that the land was more hospitable. Ronan led the way. By noon they crested a small ridge and looked down into a lightly wooded valley. Off to one side, partially obscured by vines and creeping moss, stood the structure he had mentioned, a tall cylindrical watchtower made of stone. Much of its outer walls had collapsed, and the rooftop was long gone, leaving the upper levels exposed. Still, it looked sturdy enough at the base. Helena's curiosity piqued as she imagined what it must have been like when it was in use. Perhaps centuries ago, a vantage point for pack warriors on the lookout for invaders. They descended the slope carefully, mindful of loose gravel. As they approached the tower, Ronan motioned for Helena to stay back, while he circled around to check for signs of occupants. She gripped her dagger, scanning the trees. The place was eerily silent, with only the whisper of wind across broken stone. After a few minutes, Ronan returned, shaking his head. "No fresh tracks," he said. "We might be alone here." Helena exhaled in relief, stepping forward to peer through the shattered doorway. The interior was dim and strewn with debris, fallen beams, crumbled bricks, and patches of invasive weeds that had thrust up between cracks in the stone floor. A narrow staircase clung to one side, spiraling upward into the remnants of a second level. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the wall, illuminating swirling dust motes. The place smelled of damp stone and long neglect, and yet Helena found it oddly enchanting, like a ruin that held stories waiting to be told. They ventured inside, stepping over rubble. Ronan tested the first steps of the spiral staircase. "It feels stable enough," he remarked, and Helena followed him cautiously. The second floor was partially open to the sky, where the roof had collapsed, but there was a corner sheltered by a segment of vaulted ceiling that remained intact. It would keep out the worst of the elements if it rained. They found scattered remnants of what might have been old cots or benches, now decayed beyond recognition. "This is better than nothing," Helena said, setting her bag down. She stretched, glad to be out of the marsh and within walls, however broken. "We can stay here for a day or two while we hunt and rest." Ronan grunted in agreement. "We'll have to stay alert, but at least this place has some defensible angles. If anything tries to come through that doorway downstairs, we'll hear them." They unpacked what meager supplies they had left. Helena used the scraps of wood that lay scattered around to build a small fire in a section of the tower that had an opening in the wall, allowing smoke to escape. Ronan surveyed the clearing beyond, searching for any sign of rogue activity. The day had turned overcast, and a breeze carried the threat of rain. They shared a silent meal of the last of their dried meat, along with a few of the reeds they had gathered in the marsh. It wasn't sumptuous by any means, but it would keep them going. Afterward, Helena inspected the upper level more thoroughly. She ran her fingers along the moss-covered stone, imagining the warriors of long ago who might have stood here, scanning the horizon for enemies. In a corner, she discovered a tattered piece of cloth, perhaps once part of a banner. She picked it up, feeling a peculiar sense of nostalgia for a history she did not know. Her reverie broke when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw Ronan watching her with an inscrutable expression. "This tower belonged to an older pack," he said, voice subdued. "One that no longer exists. Wars, betrayal eventually. They collapsed. The border lines shifted, new packs rose, and the old territories were forgotten. That's how it goes in our world. Our world." She held the cloth, meeting his gaze. "How do you know so much about it?" His jaw twitched slightly, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. Benny said, "I've been on my own a long time. You hear stories, learn bits of lore. I make it my business to know what happened where, so I don't blunder into a place that might be claimed or cursed." Helena felt a twist of sympathy. "Cursed," she repeated softly. "That's what they called me, you know. My old pack. They said I was a curse because my parents died the night rogues attacked." Ronan nodded, as though he had already suspected as much. "Idiots," he muttered. "Their loss, not yours." Something in those words touched her, and she found her throat tightening. "Thank you," she managed, a faint tremor in her voice. She stared at the ruined banner in her hands, wondering how many wolves had placed their faith in whatever symbol it once bore, only to be forgotten. It felt like a reflection of her own life, cast aside for reasons beyond her control. She inhaled, setting the cloth aside. "Let's gather wood," she said. "If rain comes, I'd rather have enough to keep a fire going." They spent the rest of the afternoon searching the vicinity for firewood and anything edible. Helena managed to flush out a couple of game birds in a nearby thicket, but they escaped before she could catch them. Roman, on the other hand, successfully snared a grouse with a quick lunge in wolf form. By the time they returned to the tower, gray clouds had rolled in, and fat droplets of rain began to fall, pattering against the broken stones. They hurried inside, stashing the firewood in the driest corner they could find. Water trickled down the crumbled walls, forming puddles along the floor. The wind moaned through the gaps, but the corner beneath the partially intact ceiling provided them some shelter. Helena built up the fire, and the flames crackled, battling the dampness. The warmth was a relief against the chill that crept in as the storm intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and she wondered if it might grow into a full tempest. She was grateful that they had walls around them, however ruined. She plucked a few wet feathers from the grouse Ronan had caught, turning it slowly over the fire to let the skin crisp. The savory smell reminded her of better times, when she and her parents had sat around a campfire on the packed summer retreats, sharing stories. The memory brought a smile and a pang of sorrow. Ronan watched the bird roast in silence. His mood seemed more subdued than usual, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the swirling storm clouds visible through the collapsed roof. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the tower's interior for a split second. Thunder rolled, and the fire sputtered at the gusts of wind that found their way in. Helena placed a few more stones around the fire to protect it. "It's really coming down," she commented, shivering slightly. Ronan nodded, leaning back against a crumbled section of wall. Rain dripped through cracks in the ceiling, forming rivulets along the stone. He shifted his weight, grimacing a bit. Helena frowned, realizing he was favoring his left side. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Just a strain," he replied curtly. "From training, probably." She grabbed a few leaves that were wide enough to hold water and arranged them beneath a steady drip, collecting some for later use. "Maybe you should let me check," she offered. "I'm not a healer, but I can see if you need bandaging." He grunted, reluctant, but eventually nodded. She moved closer and placed a hand on his rib cage where she thought the strain might be. Despite her concern, she couldn't ignore the warmth of his skin, the defined muscles beneath. It made her breath hitch slightly, and she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. "Does it hurt here?" she asked, applying gentle pressure. He winced, and she felt a tightness in the muscle. "It might be bruised. We'll need to keep it warm and not aggravate it further." She rummaged in her bag for the bandages. "Take your shirt off," she instructed, trying to keep her tone clinical. He hesitated but complied, pulling off his damp shirt. In the flickering firelight, Helena saw anew the faint tapestry of scars across his arms and chest. Each mark seemed to tell a silent tale of battles fought and survived. She wrapped the bandage around his midsection as support, careful not to pull too tight. Her heart pounded uncomfortably fast in her chest. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to catch the scent of rainwater clinging to his hair. He met her gaze briefly, and she swore something flickered in those gold irises, a spark of vulnerability, or perhaps longing. It was gone in an instant as he looked away, his jaw set. "Thank you," he muttered when she finished tying off the bandage. "It should help." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You've done more for me than I can repay," she said softly. "Let me do whatever I can." Silence settled over them. The storm raged outside, thunder echoing through the tower's open spaces. The small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Helena busied herself checking the grouse. It was nearly done roasting, so she tore off pieces of tender meat, offering half to Ronan. They ate in subdued quiet, the tension between them palpable. Each flash of lightning illuminated his features, hard lines set with determination, but also something else she couldn't name. It made her heart ache unexpectedly. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. She tensed. I'm not," she said, feeling her cheeks grow warm, though it was obvious she had been watching him. He exhaled, a low sound barely audible over the downpour. "You want to know why I'm like this, why I trust no one, why I live alone, but you're too polite to ask outright." Helena hesitated, then nodded once. "I do wonder, but I won't force you to tell me." Ronan set down his portion of meat, his posture rigid. For a long moment she thought he would shut her out again. Then, in a voice that seemed distant, he began to speak. "I was born into a pack," he said, eyes fixed on the flickering fire. "A strong one, or so I thought. My father was Beta, a respected warrior. But power shifts quickly in the world of wolves. Another alpha wanted our land, claimed we had broken an ancient agreement. Fights broke out, alliances crumbled, and in one night of betrayal, everything I knew was destroyed." He paused, each word weighted with old pain. Helena listened breathlessly, hardly daring to move. "I watched my father die, defending a cause he believed was just. My mother was taken, never saw her again. Some said she died, others said she ran. I was left alone, a boy with nothing but anger and fear. I tried to join a different pack, but there was no place for me. My presence only stirred conflict, brought grudges from the past. Eventually, I learned it was easier to live on my own. That's all I've known since." Helena's eyes burned with sympathy. She extended a hand, resting it lightly on his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No one should have to face that." He pulled away gently, but not in anger, more as though he couldn't bear the touch. "Don't pity me," he said, voice tight. "I've survived. That's enough." She withdrew her hand, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them away. She couldn't imagine the loneliness, the brutality of that life. In a strange way, it resonated with her own experiences, the loss of parents, the ostracization, but she still couldn't fathom living in isolation for so long, chased by the shadows of betrayal. The rain battered the ruined tower, as though nature echoed the sorrow in his story. They lapsed into silence again, the storm's fury unrelenting. After a while, Helena crawled closer to the fire, draping a spare piece of fabric over her shoulders for warmth. Ronan rested with his back against the stone, eyes half-lidded, as though retreating into himself after sharing so much. She didn't dare press further. If anything, she felt humbled that he had entrusted her with even that much of his past. At some point, she drifted into a doze, the lullaby of thunder guiding her into a dreamless sleep. When she woke, the storm had passed, leaving only a gentle drizzle that pattered softly on the broken stones above. Gray morning light revealed puddles and a mist that clung to the ground outside. Roman was already awake, or perhaps he had never slept. He sat nearby, shirt still off, the bandage around his ribs slightly damp but in place. He glanced her way as she stirred. "Morning," she said, her voice raspy. "Is the rain gone for good?" He nodded toward the drizzle. "It's easing up. We'll give it an hour, then see if we can scavenge something to eat." Helena noticed how stiff her muscles felt from sleeping on rough ground, but she rose with a quiet determination. Her eyes flicked to his bandage. "How does it feel?" "Better," he answered curtly. "Thanks." She gave a slight nod, busying herself with stirring the ashes of the fire. In the aftermath of his confession, there was a gentler tension between them, as if some barrier had been lowered, but not fully. She sensed he might be more vulnerable than he let on, more prone to shutting down any emotional closeness out of sheer habit. Yet she found herself wanting to stay, to help him heal in ways that went beyond bruises or strains, and that realization sent a tremor of alarm through her. She had told herself she would simply learn from him and move on, but her heart, foolish as it was, seemed to have other ideas. The drizzle subsided, and they climbed down the spiral staircase, stepping out into a world washed clean by the storm. Puddles glimmered on the grass, and the air smelled of wet stone and pine. Ronan inhaled deeply, apparently satisfied that no immediate threats lurked nearby. Together, they ventured a short distance from the tower, searching for game or edible plants. Their footsteps squelched in the soggy ground, leaving footprints that quickly filled with water. After some effort, Helena caught sight of a deer's tracks, leading deeper into the forest. She glanced at Ronan, a question in her eyes. He nodded, and they shifted to their wolf forms, coats still damp from the lingering moisture. Tracking a deer in thick undergrowth was challenging, especially when every twig and leaf seemed determined to give them away. But they persevered, creeping through the ferns with painstaking slowness. Ronan's wolf took the lead, his dark fur blending with the shadows, while Helena flanked to the side, ready to intercept if the deer bolted. They found it quietly grazing at the edge of a clearing, still damp from the rain. Helena's heart pounded. She hadn't hunted anything larger than a rabbit or grouse since leaving the pack. She knew one misstep could startle the deer, making it sprint away before they could bring it down. Ronan locked eyes with her in wolf form, his gaze sending a clear message. Circle around. She complied, creeping around a stand of saplings to position herself behind the animal. When Ronan pounced, the deer panicked, dashing straight into Helena's path. She lunged, fangs bared, but the deer was agile, twisting at the last moment. Still, Ronan crashed into it, knocking it off balance. Helena seized her chance, snapping at its flank. A brief, frantic struggle ensued, hooves flailing, teeth bared. Together, they overpowered the deer, ending its life swiftly. The adrenaline rush left Helena's limbs trembling. She shifted back, chest heaving, while Ronan did the same. Their catch was a decent-sized doe, enough to provide food for days if they preserved the meat. They worked quickly, conscious of the smell of blood in the air. Other predators might be drawn. Using a knife, Helena cut strips of meat while Ronan stood guard, scanning the forest. When they had secured as much as they could carry, they hurried back toward the watchtower. Once inside, Helena placed the fresh venison near the fire to smoke it, hoping to preserve enough for the coming days. The sense of accomplishment coursed through her. She recalled how, only weeks earlier, she had barely known how to handle a lethal situation on her own, and now she had helped bring down a deer. Ronan eyed her quietly, and she thought she detected a trace of respect in his expression. "You did good," he said. It was simple praise, but it meant more to her than any empty words from the pack ever had. They spent the rest of the day tending the meat, taking turns on watch, and drying their clothes near the heat of the flames. Helena discovered a small, half-collapsed side chamber in the tower, where an ancient table and 2 broken chairs stood covered in dust. She cleared away the debris, making space to store some of the venison. The day felt almost peaceful, the ruin of the tower providing a sanctuary from the relentless chaos of the forest. She found herself smiling at small things, the way Ronan's hair fell over his brow when he leaned forward, the peculiar shape of a bird's nest tucked in a crack of the tower wall, even the hiss of wind through the ragged stones. For once, she felt she had a semblance of home, however temporary. Yet she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that still lay between her and Ronan. Each time they brushed against each other in the narrow confines of the tower, an electric jolt seemed to pass between them, igniting a swirl of confusion and forbidden longing. She wondered if he felt it too. Sometimes she caught him staring at her from across the flames, as though wrestling with some internal battle. The knowledge that a mate bond was a sacred thing among wolves haunted her thoughts. Could it be that her wolf recognized something in him? But that seemed impossible, or at least ill-fated. He was a rogue, and she was a pack outcast. Such a bond would defy every rule and expectation. Perhaps it was just desperation, the closeness forced by their circumstances. The afternoon passed into evening, and they settled around the fire once again. The dried venison was packed away, and the tower felt a little less foreboding in the softer glow of twilight. Helena sat on the cold stone floor, hugging her knees. "Do you ever think about finding a place that isn't so broken?" she asked, letting her gaze wander over the crumbling walls. "Somewhere new, far from pack wars and rogue fights?" Ronan threw a small branch onto the fire, sending sparks flying. "Such a place is a myth," he said, but there was no venom in his voice, only resignation. "Trouble always finds you, no matter where you go." She fiddled with a loose thread on her sleeve. "I guess I'm still naive enough to hope. I never really wanted to live by the pack's rules, but I also don't want to spend the rest of my life running." He looked at her, a hint of something like compassion in his eyes. "Running isn't the only way. Sometimes you stand and fight, stake your own claim." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Me? Claim territory as a lone wolf? I barely escaped the pack with my life." He shrugged. "Stranger things have happened. You've got more grit than you realize. If you wanted to carve out a corner of these forests for yourself, who's to say you couldn't? The notion was absurd, Helena, forming a new territory." Still, she couldn't dismiss the small spark of excitement that stirred in her chest. "I probably need allies," she mused. "Wolves who could help me hold the land. I doubt that's an option when I'm branded an outcast." Roman said nothing, but his silence held weight. She felt a sudden rush of gratitude for him, for all he had done. She remembered the first time they met, how she had feared him as a monster. Now, he was the closest thing to a friend she had, though that word felt insufficient. A swirl of deeper emotion threatened to break free, and she squashed it down, afraid of what it might mean. They talked late into the night, their conversation drifting through topics like survival tactics, favorite prey, the different scents of wildflowers. At times, comfortable silence wove between them. Helena realized that she no longer worried he might abandon her to the forest's perils, nor did she recoil from his presence. She felt safe with him, which was strange and precarious all at once. In the early hours before dawn, as the fire's embers glowed faintly, Helena stretched out to sleep near the warmth. Ronan lingered on the opposite side of the flames, leaning back against a half-collapsed wall. At some point, through half-lidded eyes, Helena saw him rise and move quietly, as though he were checking the perimeter again. But this time, he returned and settled closer to her, not too close, but near enough that the heat of his body mingled with hers. She feigned sleep, unsure how to respond if he spoke. Yet she felt her heart flutter in her chest, a traitorous thrill coursing through her. Eventually she drifted off with the comforting sound of his steady breathing in her ears. The tower's broken walls might have shielded them from the outside world, but Helena suspected the real storm was brewing within. Poised to test the limits of everything she thought she knew about belonging, freedom, and the unbreakable laws of fate that governed wolfkind. She had no idea how quickly that storm would descend, or how violently it would sweep away what little peace they had found. Morning light filtered through the hollowed upper reaches of the old watchtower, casting long spears of brightness across the scattered rubble. Helena stirred, blinking away the remnants of dreams as she found herself in the same corner she had drifted to sleep in, the fire's ashes faintly warm beneath her makeshift bedding. A soft rustle told her that Ronan was also awake, and she turned to see him stoking the embers with the end of a charred stick. Despite their peculiar circumstances, sheltering in a ruined outpost, on the run from her former pack, isolated from the rest of the world, it felt strangely routine. She had grown used to the sight of him in the dim morning light, the angled planes of his face half in shadow, half lit by the fire's glow. She stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from the previous day's hunt. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, easing up into a sitting position. Ronan did not glance at her directly. "Not long enough," he replied, something like wry concern coloring his tone. "I think your body needs more rest. You've been pushing yourself non-stop." She ran a hand through her hair, which felt tangled and gritty from days of traveling without a proper wash. "I'm not used to it, but I can't afford to be weak. We should be heading out soon to check those traps you set last night. At least that might give us fresh meat." He looked at her then. Gold eyes narrowed. "Fine, but take it slow. We can't risk getting sloppy. I have a feeling trouble is close." Her breath caught at the quiet warning in his voice. She stood and gathered her supplies, making sure the venison they had preserved was secure. She remembered the old fear that her pack might send trackers after her. Carver might have decided it was not worth the effort, or he might have doubled down, determined to recapture her for the sake of pride. Either way, she could not let her guard down. They descended the tower's twisting staircase, moving cautiously over broken stones. At ground level, sunlight slanted through gaps in the walls, revealing mossy floors and scattered debris. Helena spotted faint footprints she and Ronan had left behind in the thin layer of dust. She felt a subtle pang at the thought that soon they might leave this refuge behind, and the tower would stand empty once more, crumbling into the annals of forgotten history. Outside, the morning air carried the scent of damp leaves and pine, a lingering remnant of the previous day's storm. The forest beyond the tower glistened with fresh dew, droplets clinging to ferns and low-hanging branches. They moved in silence, alert to any shift in the undergrowth, any waft of an unfamiliar scent. The tension that had shadowed them for days remained, but Helena also sensed a growing awareness in her own mind, a sharper readiness. She was no longer the frightened outcast who stumbled across the border with barely a plan. She had survived rogue attacks, learned to sharpen her instincts, and discovered a fierce determination within herself that she had never known existed. The traps Ronan set were located in a patch of forest a short distance from the tower. They had used simple snares and woven nets, relying on deer trails and rabbit runs. As they approached the first snare, Helena's gaze darted around warily. A rustle in the bushes put her on edge, but it was only a startled bird taking flight. She crouched next to the snare, gently parting some foliage. "Empty," she sighed, finding the loop undisturbed. "Let's check the others." Ronan said nothing, shifting his weight as he scanned the tree line. She noticed how he held his shoulders taut, more so than usual. When they checked the second trap, they found a small rabbit ensnared, which Helena dispatched quickly to spare it any prolonged suffering. They collected it as a modest success, then ventured toward the third trap, which was set closer to a winding stream that vanished between dense copses of birch. Helena knelt by a rocky outcrop to examine the trap's mechanism. Before she could speak, Ronan inhaled sharply, pivoting toward the line of trees, his entire body rigid. She froze, following his gaze, adrenaline already spiking. The forest seemed still, but she trusted his heightened senses. He remained motionless for an agonizing moment, then gave a low whisper. "Someone's here." In a flash, they retreated behind the outcrop, straining to hear. At first, Helena caught only the trickle of the stream. Then she heard it, the soft crack of branches, the measured footfalls of more than one person. She exchanged a look with Ronan, her heart pounding. Could it be the rogue that had prowled around their camp in the marsh, returning with reinforcements, or was it her old pack at last? Their unspoken question was answered when she heard a voice drift through the trees, a rough baritone distinct from Ronan's. "We saw tracks around here. Keep your eyes open." Another voice answered, quieter but edged with authority. "Don't make a sound. The Alpha wants them taken by surprise." Alpha. Helena's breath caught in her throat. They were Carver's men. The air seemed to grow colder as memories of the pack's courtyard and Alpha Carver's looming presence flooded her mind. She thought of Alden, the Beta's son, to whom she had been forcibly promised, and the humiliating spectacle that had sent her running. Had they truly come this far into rogue territory to retrieve her? She and Ronan traded urgent glances, each reading the other's thoughts. A confrontation seemed inevitable. Ronan signaled for Helena to step back, deeper into the cover of the rocks. Quietly, she obliged, stifling the panic rising in her chest. She could fight if she had to, but would she recognize any of the warriors? Did she have the will to face them again after all that had happened? A tense hush stretched. Then the voices grew louder, and Helena watched as at least 5 wolves emerged from the trees, all in human form, scanning the area with practiced caution. They wore the leathers and insignia of Carver's pack. She recognized a couple of them from the training grounds. Stout men with broad shoulders, accustomed to upholding the Alpha's authority. They carried weapons, short blades, hunting bows slung across their backs. Their expressions were grim, eyes flickering with readiness. One of them posed near the very outcrop that concealed Helena and Ronan. Helena's heart hammered. Could they smell her? She shrank back, pressing herself against the damp rock, grateful for the slight breeze that seemed to blow in their favor. Ronan inclined his head, silently motioning that they should circle around. Staying hidden might be feasible if the warriors decided to move on, but from the looks of it, they were systematically searching the area. Helena readied herself for the possibility of a fight, tugging her dagger from its sheath. They waited, heartbeats thudding like thunder, until the men advanced past the stream. Helena risked a peek, glimpsing the backs of their broad figures. One paused, sniffed the air, then conferred with another in hushed tones. She caught snatches of their words, something about an outcast, about retrieving her alive if possible, and a mention of a rogue. Her blood chilled at the thought of what they intended if they caught either of them. Being dragged back to Carver's domain in chains would be a fate worse than death. Ronan leaned close, his breath hot against Helena's ear. "We need to move," he murmured. "They'll find the tower soon enough." The notion seized Helena with a wave of dread. The tower had been their shelter, their place of rest, but it was also a trap if Carver's wolves cornered them there. She signaled her agreement, and they began their careful retreat, inching through the thick foliage behind the rocks. Every snapping twig felt like a gunshot in her ears. Behind them, the pack warriors continued their methodical sweep, cutting across the forest in a wide arc. They succeeded in slipping away unnoticed, forging an indirect path that curled around the stream. Each step was a gamble, as they risked stumbling into more scouts. Helena's heart remained lodged in her throat, but adrenaline sharpened her senses. She understood that days of training with Ronan had honed her stealth, her reflexes, and, most crucially, her resolve. When they had put enough distance between themselves and the warriors, they paused in a cluster of pines. "We can't stay near the tower," Ronan said, frustration lacing his voice. "They'll tear it apart, probably set up an ambush if we try going back for our supplies." Helena swallowed the rush of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "But we have food and bedding there. If we run empty-handed, we'll be back at square one, scavenging in dangerous territory, and they might chase us." She bit down on her bottom lip, thinking of all the venison she had carefully smoked, the meager comforts that they had collected. The idea of leaving everything behind stung, but she also knew that survival took priority. Ronan's expression hardened. "We should cut our losses. The pack will track us no matter where we go, especially if they suspect you're here. Alpha Carver won't leave this incomplete." She felt an old ache in her chest at the mention of Carver's name, the man who had coldly dictated her future. Her voice trembled with a fierce undercurrent of anger. "I'd rather die out here than submit to him again." Ronan's gaze flickered with sympathy or perhaps admiration. "We won't let that happen," he said, though she could sense the tension in his stance, the unspoken knowledge that a serious confrontation might be inevitable. They continued moving, soon losing themselves in the thicker parts of the forest. Whenever Helena risked a glance back, she half expected to see pack warriors hot on their trail, but for the moment they seemed to have eluded pursuit. Eventually, they ventured into a denser region where cedar and fir trees grew close enough that their branches overlapped, blocking the sun so thoroughly that the undergrowth was a tangle of vines and low brush. "We need a plan," she said, her breath shaky with equal parts anxiety and frustration. "If Carver has sent a full squad, we can't handle them alone in a direct fight." Ronan's jaw clenched, and he paused near a thick trunk. "My territory extends deeper north. I know every corner of these woods, every gully and ridge. If we keep heading that way, we can use the terrain to our advantage." A flicker of self-reproach crossed his face. "I should have trusted my instincts earlier. I sensed something was off. Now they've come farther than I expected." Helena pressed a hand lightly to his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "It's not your fault. This was my pack. They would have come for me sooner or later." He turned, meeting her gaze. In that moment, she felt the unspoken recognition that they were in this together, not simply as teacher and student in survival, not as reluctant allies, but as two wolves who shared a bond forged by adversity, something more elusive. The faint stirring inside her chest that she had tried to deny burned hotter now, especially in the face of danger. Ronan seemed to sense it too. His eyes flickered, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, tension carved into the set of his jaw. Silence weighed between them, filled by the hum of insects and the rustle of pine needles in the breeze. They pressed on, forging deeper into the wilds. The terrain was unforgiving, each step up a steep slope costing them precious energy. They skirted narrow ravines and hopped across small streams. Every time they paused, they listened for the telltale signs of pursuit. The snap of a branch, the murmur of voices, the scent of foreign wolves. Occasionally, they smelled faint traces, a whiff of pack on the wind, reminding them that Carver's men were drawing a net around the territory. By late afternoon, they reached higher ground, stepping onto a rocky plateau that offered a partial view of the valley below. Sparse evergreens dotted the landscape, and a sharp drop-off at the edge revealed jagged cliffs and thick forest beyond. The vantage point gave Helena a sense of just how vast the wilderness was. She saw no sign of the watchtower from this height. It was lost among the sea of trees and rolling hills. "We could cross the ravine and try to lose them," Helena suggested, scanning the precipitous drop that fell away to a narrow stream. A precarious-looking path wound down into the gorge, then climbed back up the far side. It might deter them if the route is too dangerous. Ronan considered it, resting his hands on his hips. "It's risky for us, too, but it might be the best chance we have." He drew in a slow breath, scanning the distant horizon. "If Kava's warriors are combing the forest systematically, they'll find that route sooner or later. But maybe we can stay ahead." She suppressed a shudder. She was exhausted, hungry, and her heart still pounded at the prospect of being cornered. Yet a defiant spark of hope flickered in her. She did not want to surrender. She would not after everything she had endured to taste freedom, no matter how harsh the wilderness could be. They began the descent, picking their way down the rocky path with extreme caution. More than once, Helena's foot slipped on loose gravel, sending pebbles clattering into the void. Ronan steadied her with a firm hand on her arm, guiding her around precarious ledges. The canyon walls soared above them in jagged shapes, and the wind whistled eerily, tugging at her hair. At the bottom, the stream was surprisingly calm, a narrow ribbon of water tumbling over rocks. A sense of relief washed over her upon reaching level ground again, but they had to keep moving to climb the opposite side. The second ascent was steeper, the path narrower, at times forcing them to scramble on hands and knees. The sun sank lower in the sky, painting the stones a fiery orange hue. Helena's thighs burned with exertion, each lung full of air tasting of dust and desperation. Still, she pressed on, determined not to show weakness. Ronan was silent, but she sensed the same grim determination in him. They finally crested the opposite ridge, just as dusk bled across the sky in streaks of purple and gold. A stand of ancient evergreens offered some cover, their massive trunks spaced widely enough to allow travel between them, but thick enough to hide them from any watchers below. Helena collapsed against one trunk, struggling to steady her breath. Ronan dropped beside her, peering down at the canyon they had crossed. His jaw tightened. "They'll see the signs of our passage, but it'll take them time to catch up. We should keep going as long as we can see." She almost argued that they needed to rest properly, but the distant echo of a howl set her nerves on edge. The haunting sound carried across the canyon, pressing like a warning into her chest. She looked at Ronan, eyes wide. "That's them, isn't it?" He nodded. "They're letting us know they're close. We can't linger." The golden light of dusk caught in his eyes, making them gleam with an almost feral intensity. "Come on." They forced their tired bodies to continue, weaving through the grand evergreens that seemed to swallow the last remnants of daylight. Twilight settled in, the forest shadows deepening. At some point, their pace slowed to a stumbling walk, exhaustion nearly choking Helena's senses. She yearned for rest, for food, for even a moment to breathe without fear. But the memory of that distant howl told her there would be no respite tonight. Eventually, they reached a small hollow nestled between two towering pines. Fallen logs and thick brush had created a natural barrier around it, and a trickle of water seeped from a rocky ledge, forming a shallow pool. Ronan halted, scanning the area with a practiced eye. "We can hide here," he said, voice low. "At least for a few hours, until we figure out our next move." Helena nodded, relief stirring in her chest. She squeezed through the gaps in the brush, finding a small clearing sheltered by a collapsed log. There was barely room for both of them, but it was dark and hidden from view. She settled onto the damp earth, leaning her head back against the log, muscles trembling from exertion. Ronan crouched at the entrance, eyes trained on the forest, listening. After a while, he whispered, "No sign of them yet." She gave a shaky nod and pulled out a small pouch of dried berries from her bag, one of the last portable foods they had left after abandoning the tower. She offered a few to Ronan, who took them without complaint, chewing slowly. The meager snack did little to quell her hunger, but it was better than nothing. Her throat felt parched, so she crawled to the seep of water and cupped it in her hands, sipping. It tasted slightly metallic but refreshingly cold. The night turned silent, except for the thrum of insects and the faint hoot of an owl. Helena's eyes grew heavy, but she feared to sleep. "I'll keep watch," she offered, though her voice cracked with fatigue. "You've been guiding us all day." Ronan glanced at her, a flicker of concern in his gaze. "You can barely stand. Get some rest. I'll wake you if there's any trouble." She shook her head stubbornly. "No, I want to do my part. I'm not just some burden you have to protect." His features softened for an instant. "I know that," he murmured, "but you need rest to fight effectively. If you collapse from exhaustion, neither of us gains anything." She pressed her lips together, knowing he was right. She was half delirious with weariness. "Fine," she whispered at last. "But I won't sleep too long." She found a patch of soft moss near the log and lay down. One hand curled around her dagger, heart pounding with the knowledge that any moment the pack might descend upon them. Still, her eyelids drifted shut almost immediately, the day's grueling march pulling her into a dreamless, heavy sleep. She woke to a gentle shake of her shoulder. Heart lurching, she sat up, dagger clutched tight, ready to defend herself. But it was only Ronan, leaning close, his face half lit by a glimmer of moonlight that peeked through the branches. "It's been quiet for hours," he said softly. "I think we might have lost them for the night. You can keep watch if you want, but be careful not to move around too much. This spot is concealed unless we make noise." She rubbed the grit from her eyes, nodding. "You get some rest then." Part of her wanted to insist they both stay awake, but that was impossible. Without rest, they stood no chance. Ronan shifted, settling against the log. Even in the dim light, she could see fatigue etched into the lines of his face, and it tugged at her heart. She recalled his story of losing everything, of becoming a lone wolf haunted by betrayal. And here he was, risking himself to keep her out of her pack's clutches. A swirl of gratitude and something more powerful blossomed in her chest. She wanted to comfort him, to thank him, but words felt insufficient. Instead, she reached out and brushed her fingers briefly over his hand. He stiffened, surprised by the contact, and she could almost sense his internal battle, the instinct to pull away versus the longing for connection. After a moment, he relaxed, not returning the touch, but not rejecting it either. Then he closed his eyes, exhaling softly. Helena kept still, listening to the sighing of the wind. The hours crawled by, her senses keyed to every creak of branches, every whisper in the underbrush. Occasionally, she heard distant howls or faint calls, but none sounded close enough to spark alarm. She wondered how large Carver's search party was and whether they had plans to pin the blame for her disappearance on rogues. Her thoughts circled like restless wolves, drifting to the notion of the mate bond, her own identity, and what future she might carve for herself if she survived. She tried not to dwell on the idea that she and Ronan might share that elusive bond, the one her people called destiny. It felt both frightening and exhilarating, and now was hardly the time to explore it. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. Ronan stirred, rolling his shoulders with a grimace. He rose without a word, stepping outside the hollow to scout the area. Helena followed, finding the dawn air chilly and smelling faintly of wet earth. No sign of the pack lurked in the immediate vicinity, but caution remained their watchword. "We should keep going before they close in," Ronan said, testing the breeze for scents. "If they can't find us soon, maybe they'll give up, or maybe they'll regroup for a bigger push." Helena wiped the dew from her brow, stifling a tired groan. "I'm ready," she lied, though every muscle still ached. They set off again, using the faint trails of wildlife to guide them deeper. By midday, exhaustion gnawed at them both, and they agreed to rest in a dry creek bed, hidden by the high banks and scattered rocks. Helena crouched behind a boulder, rummaging through her satchel for any scraps of food. She found only a handful of dried berries and a few tough strips of old venison. Ronan had no more to offer. As they chewed in brooding silence, her mind ran with anxious thoughts. Even if they evaded Carver's warriors for now, how long could they sustain this renowned-hide existence? She was about to voice her concerns when a snarl ripped through the air. Before she could blink, a rogue wolf, its fur matted and eyes wild, launched itself at the creek bed. It was not one of Carver's men, but an emaciated creature, ribs showing beneath a ragged coat. A second rogue appeared behind it, hackles raised, as if they had formed a small pack of their own. Helena barely had time to scramble to her feet before they charged, apparently seizing the opportunity to attack what looked like vulnerable trespassers in their domain. Ronan sprang up, shifting mid-leap in a swirl of dark fur. Helena sensed the fury in his snarl, the raw power as he collided with the first rogue, jaws snapping in a flash of teeth. She scrabbled back, flipping her dagger out, but the second rogue barreled into her before she could shift. She went down hard, the wind knocked out of her. A savage muzzle lunged for her throat, reeking of desperation. She hissed and twisted, slashing wildly with her blade. A pained yelp told her she had found flesh. The rogue let up for a moment, but its eyes blazed with frenzy, and it rushed again, jaws parted. Desperate, Helena forced her body to shift. Her vision wavered, bones realigning with a painful shudder, clothes tearing. In a heartbeat, she stood in wolf form, scrabbling to meet the rogue's attack. Her teeth sank into its flank, and blood welled. It snarled, twisting to clamp down on her shoulder. Pain shot through her, hot and intense. She yelped, thrashing to break free. They rolled across the rocky creek bed in a flurry of snapping fangs. Her mind spun with terror that the noise would draw more threats. Carver's warriors, or otherwise. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Ronan's thunderous growl. She glimpsed him grappling with the first rogue, the two wolves locked in a vicious struggle. He had the advantage of size and skill, but he faced an opponent fueled by desperate hunger and savage cunning. Helena focused on her own fight, biting down hard on the second rogue's leg. It recoiled with a pained screech, and she took the chance to fling it aside. Instead of fleeing, it wheeled around, jaws dripping crimson, readying itself for another charge. Anger flared in her chest. She had come too far to die like this. With a snarl, she leapt first, colliding with the robe before it could brace itself. Her momentum carried them both across the rocky ground. She snapped at its throat, adrenaline roaring through her veins. After a brief, frantic wrestle, she found purchase and bit down, ignoring the splatter of blood. The rogue went limp. Helena tore free, staggering back in horror and relief. Her breath came in ragged pants, tasting copper on her tongue. With her foe no longer a threat, she spun to help Ronan. She saw him locked in a fierce grapple with the other rogue, who managed to rake claws across his shoulder. Ronan's snarl tore the air, and he ripped his adversary free from him, hurling it to the ground. Before the rogue could rise, Ronan lunged, fangs glinting. Blood stained his muzzle as he ended the fight. Silence followed, punctuated only by the ragged heaving of breath. Shakily, Helena shifted back, collapsing naked against a boulder, her skin marred with scratches and bites. Warm blood trickled down her shoulder, and pain flared with every movement. Ronan also shifted, stumbling with a grimace. The gash across his chest dripped, and his arms bore new claw marks. He steadied himself against the rock, golden eyes still wild with the aftermath of the kill. Helena forced air into her lungs. Are you all right? He nodded, pressing a hand to his wound to staunch the bleeding. I'll heal, he rasped. You're hurt, too. She gritted her teeth, assessing the puncture marks on her shoulder. Just a scratch. Though, in truth, every part of her felt battered. They stood in weary silence, surrounded by the bodies of the two rogues. Flies began to buzz, drawn by the smell of blood. Helena's stomach lurched at the sight of the carnage. She had never killed like that before, never been forced to such brutality. She had no illusions that it was anything other than survival, yet the horror of taking a life weighed on her conscience. Ronan's expression told her he had long grown accustomed to such grim realities, but that did not lessen the tired sorrow in his eyes. At that moment, a nearby rustling made them whirl in alarm. Helena's throat seized with fear at the thought of more rogues, or worse, Parver's warriors. Her heart hammered so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. But what emerged was only a scrawny fox, sniffing at the scene before bolting away. Relief coursed through her, though it was short-lived. The fight had made a lot of noise, and any who were close enough might be drawn here. Ronan exhaled, staggering a little. We need to clean these wounds and move on. We can't stay here with the bodies. Though they were both hurting, the urgency was clear. Helena rummaged through the scattered remnants of her satchel, which had torn in the fray, retreating what was left of the bandages. She tore a strip of cloth from her ruined shirt, pressing it to the worst of her bleeding. Then, with trembling hands, she tried to address Ronan's cuts. He hissed at the sting, but allowed her to help. Each brush of her fingers against his skin sent a quiver through her chest that had nothing to do with fear. The closeness, the shared vulnerability, formed a raw connection she could not deny. When they had done what they could, they redressed in torn, blood-spattered clothes, exhaustion dragging on their every movement. Ronan steadied Helena by the arm. "Let's go," he said, voice hoarse. "We'll find somewhere safer to rest." She nodded, a wave of dizziness washing over her, but she kept her footing. With the last of her strength, she followed him upstream, hoping that the water might wash away some of their scent and the blood trail they were leaving behind. The late afternoon sun had descended into a haze of storm clouds gathering once more, and thunder rumbled in the distance. They trudged onward, step after agonizing step, until they reached an outcropping of massive stones near a waterfall. The roar of tumbling water reverberated through the glen, drowning out other noises and scents. "There," Ronan said, pointing to a shallow cave behind the waterfall's curtain. Mist drifted around the rush of water, and the fading light cast shimmering rainbows across the spray. It might be dangerous to hide in such a spot, with wet rock and uncertain footing, but it was a better option than being out in the open. They approached cautiously, feeling along the slippery rocks until they found a small opening behind the water. It was cramped, the ground uneven with jagged rocks, but it offered concealment. The sound of the waterfall would mask any small sounds they made, and the spray might dilute their sense. It was a small sanctuary in a perilous world. Helena collapsed against the damp rock, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. A persistent ache throbbed in every muscle. She glanced at Ronan, whose eyes were shuttered with fatigue. Their clothes were soaked, the cold air raising goosebumps on her arms. Yet her mind was too drained to worry about comfort. She closed her eyes, letting the roar of the falls fill her ears. She had no idea if Kava's warriors were near, or if the next rogue was only a stone's throw away, but for one fleeting moment, she let herself imagine they were safe. In that tiny hollow behind the waterfall, adrenaline ebbed, leaving them both on the edge of collapsing. As she drifted, her mind flicked to the secrets unspoken between them, the unacknowledged bond that her wolf had begun to recognize, a bond that defied logic and pitted them against fate. She wondered if that bond was the reason she couldn't walk away, the reason he kept risking himself to shield her, and she wondered whether, if the pack discovered this truth, it would spark a conflict that neither side could contain. The waterfall roared on, a relentless symphony of water against stone, as the night deepened. Helena pulled Ronan's jacket closer around her shoulders, drawing some meager warmth from his lingering body heat. Every breath reminded her that she was alive, albeit bruised and hunted, but alive. A heavy sense of foreboding lingered, telling her that the battles ahead would be fiercer, the choices more daunting. She had to stay strong if she wanted to keep that sliver of freedom she had seized on the night she left the pack. She turned to Ronan, found him awake, staring at the rush of water with an expression caught between determination and regret. Though their gazes met only briefly, in that fleeting moment, she felt a silent vow pass between them. They would fight, they would keep moving, and they would face whatever came next. Together. Daybreak stole across the sky in muted grays and blues, barely visible through the thundering veil of water. Helena stirred on the damp floor of the makeshift cave, her shoulder throbbing in protest, every bruise reminding her of the battle from the previous day. She found Ronan still awake, or perhaps awake again, sitting near the rocky entrance. Her mind registered the cold seeping through her limbs, and she grimaced as she sat up, wincing when the motion tugged at her wound. "Let me check it," Ronan said, gesturing for her to come closer. His own injuries looked raw, though the rapid healing afforded by their wolf natures had lessened the bleeding. She could see pink, ragged edges of flesh knitting together on his shoulder and arms. She complied, pulling the torn fabric of her shirt aside, so he could see the puncture marks left by the rogue's teeth. His breath hissed softly as he brushed his fingers around the inflamed area. "It needs cleaning again," he murmured, retrieving a piece of cloth from his belongings. The gentle pressure of his hand set her nerves alight with awareness, an unsettling mixture of pain and something that felt painfully close to longing. She forced herself to focus on the practicality of the moment. "That water's cold," she cautioned, eyeing the waterfall. "But it's better than leaving it to fester." He nodded. "We'll do what we must." They gathered their strength, moving to the narrow slip of space where water sprayed against the rocks. Carefully, Helena let the cold water run over her wound, biting her lip against the sting. Ronan did the same for his injuries, turning his face away to hide a grimace. They said little, each lost in their own swirl of thoughts. Once they were as clean as they could manage, they returned to the small cave. Water dripped from their hair, and Helena's teeth chattered, but the adrenaline of survival staved off any true hypothermia for now. "Any sign of them?" she asked, hugging her arms to her chest. Ronan shook his head. "Not from what I can see, but the sound of the waterfall masks everything. They could be 100 yards away, and we might not hear them approach." His gold eyes met hers. "We can't stay here." She agreed, though fear twisted her stomach. Should we head deeper north, or try another route? His jaw tightened. North would take us farther from Carver's land, deeper into rogue territory. We might run into more packs of rogues like the ones we fought, but we can use my knowledge of the terrain to hide more effectively. End co. His gaze flicked to her wounded shoulder. "Can you handle the journey? There won't be easy paths once we get into the foothills." Her heart fluttered at the concern in his voice. "I'll manage," she said firmly. "I'd rather face unknown rogues than Carver's men. At least the rogues won't try to drag me back to a forced future." Ronan exhaled softly, a look passing over his face that spoke volumes. "All right," he said at last, glancing at the faint light beyond the falls. "We should leave soon. The longer we wait, the more risk we take." They shared a quick cold meal of leftover berries and a bit of dried meat. Each bite tasted like ash in Helena's mouth, tension making her stomach churn. She felt lightheaded from her injuries and the meager sustenance, but determination fueled her. Then, bracing themselves against the slick rock, they slipped out of the cave, once more greeted by the roar of cascading water. The morning was overcast, the sky a dull pewter that made it hard to guess the time. Swathes of fog drifted through the pine groves. The air smelled fresh, laced with the tang of damp stone and crushed greenery. Helena drew in a steadying breath. This wilderness was both enemy and ally, a place that could devour them if they were careless, but also the shield that kept them out of sight from Carver. They began their trek northward, forging through a stretch of rocky ground softened by moss and scattered pine needles. The forest seemed empty, the hush broken only by bird calls and the occasional drip of water from branches overhead. Helena tried to keep her senses sharp, but fatigue dragged at her with every step. She stumbled more than once on hidden roots, and each time Ronan caught her arm to steady her. The press of his fingers sent a flutter through her that she tried desperately to ignore. He was her protector and teacher in these wilds, but she could not deny the slow burn of attraction that had grown within her ever since their first dangerous meeting. The bond her wolf recognized only deepened that feeling, even though she had no idea if he felt the same. They traveled for hours. The terrain grew harsher, with steep inclines that forced them to cling to branches for support. At one point, they came upon a rocky waterfall that emptied into a narrow gorge. They skirted around it, feet slipping on moss-slick stones. Midday passed without the sun truly making an appearance. Helena feared they might be going in circles, but Ronan seemed to know where he was heading, guiding them through hidden valleys and dense thickets. Occasionally, he paused to mark a tree with his scent, an odd practice that she guessed helped him reclaim or assert his territory, even amid so much upheaval. The relentless pushing onward eventually wore them both down. By late afternoon, the forest began to thin, giving way to a rugged stretch of open slopes dotted with coarse grass and scatterings of evergreen shrubs. Clouds hung low, threatening rain. They paused at the edge of this open ground, gazing warily at the vast expanse. A gust of wind caught Helena's hair, and she shivered. Ronan scanned the horizon. "Crossing this will be dangerous," he murmured. "We'll be exposed. But if we can get to the other side, there are caves in the cliffs where we can hide." Helena frowned at the thought of stepping into plain sight. She recalled the pack's archers, how skilled they were at picking off prey from a distance. Yet it was a chance they might have to take. "If we wait till dusk, maybe we can use the darkness as cover," she suggested. Ronan considered it, gaze flicking across the rolling slopes. The wind whipped at his hair. "All right," he agreed. "We'll find shelter in those pines back there. Watch for any sign of them, and move when the light fades." They retreated into the tree line to wait. Helena settled against a large stone, biting into the last of the dried meat she had left. Her stomach rumbled, unsatisfied, but there was little else to eat. She thought about how dire their situation was. They couldn't hunt effectively while running for their lives, and rummaging for plants in unfamiliar terrain seemed too risky with Carver's men possibly lurking. She forced herself to swallow the lumps of fear and hunger, reminding herself she had chosen this path. Freedom, however precarious, was better than living under Carver's iron rule. Ronan stayed beside her, equally tense. She could sense the turmoil in him, the strain of feeling responsible not only for himself, but for her as well. Beneath that, something stirred that had nothing to do with survival. A flicker of energy between them that neither acknowledged aloud. She thought of the stories she had heard about the mate bond, how wolves knew it by scent and instinct, how it could transcend rank and territory. A pang of guilt accompanied that thought. She remembered how the alpha had tried to force her to accept another mate, the beta's son, for the sake of alliances. It had never felt right, but this what she felt now, whatever it was, had grown stronger with each moment she spent near Ronan, each shared breath of danger and closeness. The hours dragged, the sky deepening toward dusk. A few drops of rain fell, then stopped. Helena tensed every time a branch snapped or an animal rustled by, imagining Carver's warriors. But no confrontation occurred, and eventually the light began to fade. Ronan stood, scanning the open slopes. "Now," he whispered. They crept from the pines, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The wind had picked up, causing the shrubs to shiver and the scattered tree branches to bend. Helena felt the chill bite into her exposed skin, but she stayed focused on the terrain ahead. They moved in short bursts, dashing from one patch of cover to another. The land sloped gently upward, offering a partial view of the valley behind them. Each time she dared a glance back, she saw only dim shapes. The low-hanging clouds made it impossible to see far, which was both a blessing and a curse. They were nearly halfway across the open expanse when a distant cry sliced the air. Helena froze, heart clenching. Another cry answered, echoing off the slopes. The pack. They had spotted them, or at least caught their scent. Ronan let out a low snarl of frustration. "Move," he commanded, grabbing Helena's hand. She followed without hesitation, adrenaline surging in her veins. They sprinted, ignoring the way their bodies screamed for rest. The ground underfoot was slick in places, rocky in others, forcing them to dart around obstacles. All the while, Helena heard howls behind them, drawing closer. The pursuit was on. She risked a backward glance and saw silhouettes cresting a ridge in the gloom. There had to be at least 4 or 5, maybe more. Her heart thundered. Ronan pulled her onward, guiding her toward a rocky bluff rising in the near distance. At its base loomed dark shapes, potential cave mouths. If they could reach one, perhaps they could defend themselves, or conceal their scent. The plan was desperate, but they had no other choice. Helena's lungs burned as she tried to match Ronan's pace, the pain in her shoulder flaring. She stumbled, nearly pitching forward. He yanked her upright, not letting go of her hand. Behind them, the howls grew louder. She could almost feel the pack closing in, like a dark tide. When they finally reached the mouth of a cave, they all but threw themselves inside. Darkness enveloped them, and Helena tripped over unseen rocks, bruising her knee. The air smelled of damp stone and stale earth. A tight, claustrophobic chill slid along her spine. Ronan spun around, breath ragged, scanning the entrance. "We need to go deeper," he hissed. "If they catch us at the mouth, we'll be cornered." She swallowed her fear and nodded, groping through the blackness for any semblance of a passage. Her fingers slid across slick walls, feeling the cold seep into her bones. Gradually, her eyes adjusted. A faint glow from outside lingered, but it soon gave way to darkness. The floor sloped down, forcing them to move carefully. Then she spotted a narrow crevice off to one side, twisting deeper underground. She motioned to Ronan. They edged into it, the space barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, their shoulders scraping stone. Her heart pounded as she imagined the pack pouring into the main chamber behind them. She prayed the labyrinth of passages might confuse any pursuers. Sweat slicked her palms, and she had to remind herself to breathe evenly. Ronan led the way, running his hand along the wall, testing each step before committing to it. She followed close, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the faint echoes of dripping water amplifying the tension. At last, they reached a cramped cavern, no bigger than a modest room, with a ceiling just high enough to stand upright. A trickle of water ran from a small fissure in the rock, forming a puddle on the floor. The air was cold and smelled of minerals. Ronan pressed a finger to his lips, indicating silence. Helena forced her breathing to quiet, though her pulse thundered in her ears. They waited, bodies rigid. She tried to catch a hint of sound from the main tunnel. For a moment, all was still. Then a distant scuffling reached her ears, like boots scraping on stone. Her stomach twisted. They had followed them inside. Her mouth went dry with terror. Ronan tensed, a low growl slipping from his throat. If they were discovered here, they would have little space to fight or flee. She glanced around the cramped cavern, eyes searching for another exit. All she saw was solid rock, the only opening the one they had come through. If the pack cornered them, it would be a slaughter. Her fingers clenched around the hilt of her dagger, though she doubted it would do much good. She forced herself to remain calm, to trust that they might remain undiscovered if they kept quiet. It was a slender hope. Several agonizing minutes dragged on. The sounds of movement echoed faintly, muffled voices, the crack of a torch sparking. Helena's heart hammered so fiercely that she feared they would hear it. She and Ronan pressed themselves against the cold wall, barely daring to breathe. She thought of the day she left the pack, how desperate and hopeless she had felt. Now, that same desperation filled her once more. Yet this time, she was not alone. She shot a glance at Ronan, his figure barely visible in the darkness. Even in silhouette, the tension radiated from him, and she sensed his resolve to defend her to the last breath. She closed her eyes, feeling the swirl of emotions that had become so entwined with her survival. She knew, beyond any doubt, that she felt something for him, something fierce, raw, and unstoppable, like the forest storms that battered these mountains. And she suspected a part of him felt it too, though he guarded his heart behind walls thicker than any fortress. A sudden shout rang out, reverberating through the cave system. "There are footprints here. Spread out." Helena's blood turned to ice. Another voice echoed in response. "Check every tunnel." Ronan gripped her arm, cautioning her to remain still. The scuffing sounds grew louder, as if the men fanned out through multiple passages. One group was definitely heading in their direction, though the rocky twist seemed to distort the exact distance. Helena's muscles ached from holding so still. She braced, ready to fight if they had to. She felt a flicker of anger at Carver for pushing this so far, for refusing to let her go, for forcing everyone into this relentless pursuit. She silently vowed that if she escaped this cave, she would not let him dictate her life again. Torchlight flickered faintly against the stone at the entrance to their cramped cavern. Her heart lunged into her throat. A single figure advanced, the glow of fire dancing off the damp walls, revealing the silhouette of a pack warrior. Helena recognized him, one of Carver's favored scouts, a wolf named Radley who excelled at tracking. He held a torch high, scanning the walls, his other hand on the hilt of the short sword. The dancing flame cast shadows that moved like wraiths. Ronan tensed beside her. The flicker of the torch threatened to expose them in their hiding spot. Helena felt every nerve in her body scream for them to attack preemptively, but Ronan's grip on her arm prevented her from lunging. The scout took another step inside, eyes narrowed, searching. Helena pressed herself as far into the corner as she could, her heart a drumbeat of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, half expecting a shout of discovery, or the blade's steel glint aimed in her direction. But Radley paused, frowned at the puddle of water on the floor, and, after a moment, turned away. He muttered something about a dead end, the words bouncing off the walls in a distorted echo. Then he retreated, torchlight vanishing as he moved back into the passage. Helena stifled a gasp of relief. Ronan's grip slackened slightly, though he remained poised to defend. They waited in tense silence. The scout's footsteps receded, joining the other voices deeper in the cave. Shouts mingled in the corridors, too distant to make out clearly. Eventually, the chaotic echoes moved away, heading back toward the main entrance. Helena opened her eyes, every muscle trembling from the prolonged strain. She glanced at Ronan. His breathing was quiet, but his brow glistened with sweat, and his eyes held that same wild intensity. They had come hair's breadth from being discovered. She could scarcely comprehend how lucky they had been. Through the oppressive hush, she heard the pack regroup, their torches casting shadows in the larger cavern beyond. One voice spoke clearly, "Not here. Move on." Helena's knees threatened to buckle in relief as the footsteps receded. She felt tears prick at her eyes, a flood of emotion triggered by the close call, the exhaustion, and the swirl of deeper feelings that pinned her heart. Slowly, she and Ronan sagged against the cold stone. Neither of them dared to speak, waiting until they were sure the pack had fully retreated from the cave system. The minutes dragged on like hours, but at last the echoes faded, replaced by the dripping water and the faint rasp of their breathing. She let out a trembling exhale. Ronan closed his eyes for a moment, as though wrestling with a flood of conflicting thoughts. When he opened them, he looked at her in the dimness, the flicker of raw emotion crossing his face. "We can't keep running forever," he whispered, his voice tight with suppressed anger and something else. "Carver will keep sending them, or he'll come himself. And if we cross further north, we'll face endless rogue factions. We're cornered." Helena's heart clenched. She realized he was right. Their entire strategy had been to run, to evade, but the pack's pursuit was relentless. Even if they survived the roving rogues, Carver's men would be an ever-present threat. She swallowed thickly, her throat dry. "Then what choice do we have?" she asked, voice trembling. A dark determination glinted in Ronan's eyes. "We make a stand," he said, as though the notion had been building in him for days. "We find a place to draw them out on our terms, a place where we have the advantage. We fight, because if we don't, they'll hunt us down one by one, no matter where we run." Her pulse drummed at the finality in his words. Fight Carver's warriors? The thought was daunting. They were outnumbered, battered, and exhausted, but a spark of defiance welled in her. If the pack refused to grant her freedom, she would take it by force. If Carver insisted on recapturing her for the sake of his reputation, she would show him just how strong an outcast could be. She looked at Ronan and saw the reflection of that determination. Slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But we can't take on the entire pack alone. We'd be overwhelmed in a heartbeat." He ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "I know. We need to be strategic. There's a place in these woods, northwest of here. It's an old canyon with high walls and narrow entrances. I've used it before to fend off hostile rogues. If we lure Carver's men in there, can pick them off." She mulled it over, adrenaline stirring. "Lure them how?" He gave her a grim smile. "You're the prize they're after, right? If we make them think they have us cornered, they'll come in force. We just have to make sure we have the advantage of the terrain." Her stomach churned at the thought of using herself as bait, but she saw no alternative. Ronan was right. Their flight was unsustainable, and Carver would never quit until he had her under his thumb again, or she lay dead. She squared her shoulders, ignoring the pain in her wound. "Then let's do it," she said softly, a tremor in her voice. "I'm tired of running." For a moment, something like admiration shone in Ronan's eyes. Without warning, he cupped her face gently, pulling her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Her heart soared into her throat, and every nerve in her body sparked with awareness. She expected him to speak, but instead, he lowered his mouth to hers in a tentative kiss, as though offering a silent promise. The sensation spread through her, potent as the rush of her wolf instincts, igniting every hidden corner of her soul. She melted into it, clinging to him despite the cold stone pressing her back, the fear swirling outside their fragile haven. When he pulled away, they were both breathing hard. Their eyes met in the darkness, unspoken emotions crackling between them. No words seemed adequate. Her wolf, half awakened inside her, roiled with excitement and a fierce satisfaction at the confirmation of what she had suspected all along, that some fundamental bond tied them together, deeper than any contract or pact decree. She sensed the conflict in him, the awareness that claiming a mate, especially one from a pack that despised him, would spark a wildfire of consequences. Yet in that moment, neither could deny it. "Whatever happens next," she whispered, her voice shaky, "we face it together." He nodded, silent but resolute, his hand lingering against her cheek before withdrawing. Then, with renewed focus, he pushed to his feet. "We should leave the cave before they circle back," he said, back to the clipped tones of strategy. "We head northwest, find the canyon, and prepare for a confrontation that will end this chase one way or another." She rose on unsteady legs, feeling a heady blend of fear and exhilaration. Gathering what few supplies they still had, They wove back through the tight passages, stepping cautiously into the main cavern. The pack had vacated the tunnels. Helena spotted a charred piece of torch lying on the floor, testament to how close they had come to being discovered. Her stomach twisted at the memory. They emerged into the fading daylight. The sky was a dull iron color, threatening more rain, or perhaps a storm. The ground outside the cave bore the unmistakable footprints of multiple wolves, the mud churned by their passing. Ronan cast a last look at the tracks, jaw clenched, then motioned for Helena to follow. Their new course was set. They wound through the slopes, staying off main trails to avoid falling into the pack's hands. Dusk deepened, blending the world into shadows. Occasionally, they paused, straining to hear the faint howls or hunting horns that might signal pursuit, but the forest fell silent again, as though gathering breath for the impending showdown. Helena couldn't help the flutter of nerves, recalling the nightmares she used to have in the pack's compound. That felt like a lifetime ago. They pushed on until moonlight gilded the pines, finally halting near a small ridge that overlooked a valley. In the distance, Helena could see craggy formations rising against the dark sky, illuminated by faint starlight. The canyon loomed, a natural fortress of stone walls and winding passages. She turned to Ronan, swallowing. "How far?" "By tomorrow. If we move swiftly, we'll be there," he replied. "We can set traps along the entrances. Choose the best vantage. It will force them to funnel in. Even if they have more numbers, we'll hold an advantage." Her heart thundered at the idea of a final stand. The next day might decide everything: her freedom, their fates, and whether they could truly stand against an alpha's wrath. She stepped closer to Ronan, drawn by the unspoken bond that had begun to tangle their lives. His presence steadied her, offered a bracing hope in the face of daunting odds. "Ronan," she said softly, swallowing the dryness in her throat. "Thank you for all of this." He exhaled, tension flickering across his rugged features. "Don't thank me yet," he murmured, gaze flicking to the distant canyon. "If we make it out of this alive, then we can decide what happens next." She nodded, though her thoughts churned with uncertainty. Even if they triumphed, what then? Carver's pack might be beaten, but the world would not suddenly open its arms to a rogue alpha and the outcast who defied her people. She felt the swirl of conflicting loyalties, the faint memory of her parents' place in the pack, the old teachings that said a mate bond was a sacred union. Could she truly start anew in the wilderness? Could they create a life free from persecution? As she leaned into his warmth, she decided that she would face those questions only after they survived. For now, she would cling to the fragile spark of connection that glowed between them, fueling her with a resolve she had never known. Perhaps that would be enough. They shared a fitful rest beneath the moon's quiet light, pressing together for warmth. Neither slept well, haunted by the approach of the next dawn and the violence it might bring. When morning arrived in a haze of mist, they set out again without a word, making a silent vow to see the plan through. The landscape changed as they neared the canyon, shifting from rolling woodland to rugged outcroppings of stone and steep ravines. The trees grew sparser, the wind sharper. By midday, they stood at the lip of a great chasm carved into the earth, its walls towering in places, pockmarked with ledges and narrow trails. Several narrow entrances opened along its perimeter, like jagged mouths waiting to swallow the unwary. Ronan pointed to a bend in the canyon floor below, where a dried riverbed snaked through dusty ground. "That's where we'll draw them in," he said. "We'll set traps along the side paths. They climbed down carefully, nerves on edge. Helena noted how her footsteps kicked loose small stones that clattered eerily into the depths. It felt like stepping into another world, quiet, desolate, and filled with hidden perils. Ronan led her along the canyon floor, pointing out vantage points where they could hide, small ledges where archers might stand if they had bows. But they possessed no bow, no quiver of arrows, only blades and their wolf forms. They would rely on cunning and the natural hazards of the terrain to even the odds. Once they reached the center, they scouted each possible entrance. The walls rose high on every side, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air was cooler, almost cave-like in its stillness. They found old fallen timber and sharp rocks they could position in choke points. Ronan showed Helena how to craft simple snares with the meager rope they carried, rigging them so that anyone who rushed through too quickly might be caught or at least knocked off balance. She worked in silence, hands shaking as she pictured Carver's warriors tripping over the lines. By late afternoon, they had set what traps they could, though Helena wished they had more resources. Ronan looked at their handiwork with stoic acceptance, then guided her to a narrow ledge that overlooked the main path into the canyon. "We'll wait here," he said, climbing up onto the rocky platform. From that vantage, they could see most of the canyon floor. A single approach from the east offered an unimpeded route in. The other paths were partially blocked by rubble, which they had augmented to force any serious assault into a funnel. As they settled in, the sky above began to dim, the canyon's height making evening come early. Helena felt like a trapped animal in a cage of their own design, ironically waiting for the predator to come. Her pulse raced at every gust of wind, every distant echo. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. She recalled the moment she had slipped away from the pack's walls, the naive hope that freedom lay beyond. How quickly she had learned that freedom came at a brutal cost. The hush broke sometime after sunset. A faint howl reached their ears, reverberating off the canyon walls. It was answered by another, closer. Helena's throat tightened. They had arrived. She and Ronan exchanged a weighted look. Then they tensed, scanning the shadows below. Faint torchlight bobbed at the canyon's edge, a flicker of orange in the gloom. Helena's hands clenched into fists. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, ready to transform at a moment's notice. In the dimness, she saw shapes entering the canyon. Carver's warriors, possibly a dozen or more. They moved cautiously, aware that they might be walking into an ambush, but their confidence showed in the way they spread out. Helena's heart drummed as she recognized one figure near the front. It was Alden, the Beta's son, the man she was supposed to marry by Carver's decree. She couldn't make out his features clearly from this height, but she remembered well the cold detachment in his eyes. She swallowed, feeling a tremor of rage that she had almost been forced to bind herself to him. Ronan's jaw flexed, and he crouched lower on the ledge, motioning for Helena to do the same. The warriors advanced further, though not recklessly. They must have sensed something off about the terrain. She heard their hushed commands, the clink of weapons against belts. The torchlight revealed the tension in their postures. Then one of them kicked a hidden rope, triggering a small avalanche of rocks. The loud clatter echoed through the canyon. A startled shout went up, and the formation of warriors scrambled back, some stumbling into the choke point they had prepared. Another series of well-placed traps sprang, logs rolling, sharpened stakes tipping over. Chaos erupted. In a heartbeat, Helena saw several warriors pinned by falling rubble, while others darted aside, cursing. She locked eyes with Ronan, who gave her a curt nod. Now was their moment. They leapt from the ledge, shifting midair in a flurry of wolf and swirling clothes. Helena's paws hit the canyon floor with a jarring impact. Her wolf form snarled, adrenaline roaring. She lunged at the nearest warrior who had sidestepped a trap. Her jaws closed on his arm, and he screamed. She felt a pang of horror, but forced herself to continue. This was life or death. She let go, spinning away as another warrior swung a blade. Ronan's massive black wolf barreled into a group of them, scattering them like leaves. Helena caught glimpses of the savage skill he wielded, a ferocious onslaught that left howls of pain in its wake. But the pack had numbers, and they weren't amateurs. They spread out, launching a counterattack. She narrowly avoided an arrow that whizzed past. The archer perched on a chunk of high rock. Her wolf hissed with fury, and she scrambled up a slanted boulder to dislodge him. They grappled, the archer losing his bow in the process, and tumbled into the dust. She sank her teeth into his leg, forcing him to drop his dagger. A surge of warriors poured in, trying to surround them. The carefully laid traps slowed them, but the pack's discipline kept them from outright panic. Helena saw Alden among them, barking orders, face twisted with hostility. A sickening pang shot through her. She remembered his vacant gaze the day Alpha Carver announced their betrothal. Now, she saw ice in his eyes, sharpened by the humiliation of her escape. Ronan was fending off two swordsmen near a collapsed log trap, blood matting his fur where a blade had grazed him. He moved with lethal grace, a savage dance of claws and fangs. Helena lunged to assist, snapping at one soldier's leg. The man yelled, staggering. Ronan seized the opening, biting down on the soldier's shoulder. The other man slashed at them, but Helena pounced, knocking the sword from his grip. She felt the burn of a shallow cut across her flank, hot blood trickling, but adrenaline drowned the pain. The battle seesawed violently across the canyon floor. Screams, snarls, and the crash of falling rocks reverberated in the darkness. Helena lost count of how many times she narrowly evaded a killing blow, or how many wounds she and Ronan inflicted. She felt torn between terror and a grim certainty that this was the only path to freedom. The pack would not retreat without a decisive outcome. Suddenly, a powerful aura descended on the field of battle, an Alpha's presence that chilled Helena to the bone. Emerging from the gloom at the canyon entrance was Carver himself, tall and broad, wearing a dark expression that promised retribution. He held a curved blade, edged in silver, and his eyes burned with rage. The few remaining warriors rallied around him, reforming ranks despite the traps. Helena realized that no matter how many warriors they bested, Carver's leadership made the pack formidable. He met her wolf's gaze, and a sneer curled his lips. "There you are," he snarled, voice echoing. The outcast who thought she could defy her alpha. He turned his glare to Ronan, who panted heavily, blood staining his muzzle and fur. Carver's sneer deepened. "And a rogue no less. Did you think you could hide forever? This ends now." Alden flanked Carver, hate etched into his features. "You humiliated me," he spat at Helena, brandishing a short blade. "You'll pay for that with your life." In wolf form, Helena growled low in her throat, the beast in her bristling with defiance. She caught a glimpse of Ronan, whose golden eyes blazed with unwavering resolve. With a snarl, he lunged at Carver, unwilling to wait for the Alpha to set the terms. Their collision was thunderous, the clash of fang and blade. Carver was strong, faster than expected for a man of his age and size, but Ronan had the sheer power of a rogue alpha in his wolf body, muscle coiled to strike with deadly precision. They whirled together, each seeking a killing blow. The remaining warriors rushed in to protect their alpha, forcing Helena to intercept. She leapt between them, taking down one soldier in a flurry of claws. Another came at her, slashing. She yowled in pain as the blade cut across her hind leg, but she whirled, fangs bared, driving him back. Alden joined the fray, eyes locked on her with bitter fury. Fear stabbed through her. He had always been a skilled fighter in training sessions, excelling with the blade. Now, he showed no mercy. He lunged, swinging at her with lethal intent. She backed away, searching for an opening to shift back to human form and use her dagger. But Alden pressed her relentlessly, backing her toward a pile of rubble. Her wounded leg ached, forcing her to limp. She feared that if she slipped, he would deliver a fatal strike. Above the din, she heard Ronan's fierce snarl as he fought Carver. Desperate, she feinted right, then leapt left, hoping to catch Alden off guard. He slashed again, his blade grazing her flank, opening a shallow wound. She yelped, blood matting her fur. She bit down on the panic and circled around, forcing her wolf body to endure. Alden sneered. "Is this all your precious freedom bought you?" he spat, lunging again. "A savage life on the run, just to end up torn apart by those you betrayed." Helena's wolf rumbled with fury. She sprang, her jaws aimed at his sword arm. He tried to sidestep, but she raked her claws across his forearm. He cried out, dropping the blade, but swiftly drew another from his belt. She twisted to avoid it, but he struck, cutting along her shoulder. Pain flared like fire, sapping her strength. Meanwhile, Ronan and Carver clashed in a vicious, drawn-out struggle. Ronan managed to knock Carver off balance, but the alpha slashed his blade across Ronan's side. Blood splattered the dust. Ronan howled in pain, his wolf form wavering as he nearly collapsed. Carver advanced, eyes gleaming with triumph. In one swift motion, he went for a killing blow. But Ronan, at the last possible instant, found a burst of strength. He shifted back to human form, surprising Carver. He seized the alpha's arm, twisting it. Carver roared in fury, losing grip on his weapon. Ronan's hand closed around Carver's throat, fangs bared in a half-wolf, half-human snarl. With a savage heave, he slammed Carver into the canyon wall. Helena, still locked in combat with Alden, saw the opening as Alden glanced at Carver in alarm. She mustered every ounce of will, ignoring her bleeding flank, and launched herself at Alden. This time her teeth sank into his shoulder before he could raise his blade. He screamed, dropping the weapon again. She tore away, panting, tasting the copper tang of blood. Alden stumbled backward, clutching his shredded flesh, eyes wide with shock and hate. He collapsed against the rubble, breathing in rasps, effectively out of the fight. Ronan pinned Carver, who fought back with desperate ferocity, half shifting into wolf form. Their limbs tangled, claws raking flesh. Helena limped forward, determined to help. Though her head spun with blood loss, she forced her wolf form to shift back into a battered human body. She fumbled for the dagger she had strapped to her leg. By the time she reached them, Carver had broken free of Ronan's grasp. He backhanded Ronan viciously, sending him crashing to the ground. Ronan lay dazed, blood dripping from a cut above his brow. Carver turned on Helena, his eyes blazing with triumph. "You worthless outcast," he snarled, voice ragged. "You've brought this on yourself." He lunged at her, but she raised the dagger, bracing it with both hands, her entire being fueled by the refusal to submit. His weight slammed into her, and she teetered, nearly toppling. With a cry, she twisted the blade forward. A sickening gasp left Carver's lips as he impaled himself on the dagger's edge. Time seemed to slow. She felt the heat of his blood spatter her hands, saw the disbelief flicker across his contorted face. For a heartbeat, he stared at her, anger turning to shock. Then he collapsed to his knees. She wrenched the dagger free, breathing in ragged sobs. The alpha groped at the wound in his chest, choking on blood. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped to the ground, his grip on life extinguished in a final, shuddering breath. Silence clamped down on the canyon. The few remaining warriors, demoralized by the death of their alpha, ceased fighting, some retreating in horror, others staring in disbelief. Alden groaned from where he had fallen, arms trembling. One or two of Carver's men began to drag him away, unwilling to continue a hopeless battle. The rest scattered into the night, the pack undone by the loss of its leader. Helena stood over Carver's body, chest heaving, dagger still clutched in her shaking hands. She could not believe it. She had just killed an alpha. She remembered him towering over her in the courtyard, dictating her fate. Now, he lay lifeless at her feet, undone by the determination of the very person he had deemed worthless. A tremor ran through her, and she stumbled backward, nearly collapsing as the shock and injuries took their toll. Ronan pushed himself up with a groan, staggering to her side. Blood seeped from the wounds on his torso, and his face was pale from exertion. Yet he wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's over," he whispered, eyes flicking across the carnage. "They're running." She closed her eyes, letting the dagger slip from her grip, tears mingling with the dust on her cheeks. The reality of it all hammered at her senses. The brutality of the fight, the finality of Carver's death, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But most of all, she felt the profound relief of liberation. Her pack's alpha was gone, and the forced bond that had haunted her was severed. If the pack tried to regroup under a new leader, it would be a weaker entity for a long while, likely unable to mount another sustained hunt for her any time soon. Ronan supported her, pressing a hand to her bleeding flank. "We need to get those wounds tended," he murmured, worry etching his features. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. Together they limped away from the scene of blood and dust, leaning on each other for support. The canyon walls loomed overhead, painted with the brushstrokes of moonlight. Around them, the few surviving warriors vanished into the night. Alden was gone, dragged away by frightened men. None had the will to keep fighting, not after seeing their alpha fall. They eventually found shelter at the canyon's edge, in a hollow beneath an overhanging rock. There, they collapsed, exhausted and bleeding. Helena pressed a torn scrap of cloth to her flank. Ronan, still trembling, tried to clean the gashes across his chest. Their eyes met in the faint glow of the moon, each reflecting awe and grief. Helena wanted to speak, to say anything that might capture the torrent of emotions inside her, but words failed her. Ronan broke the silence first, voice hoarse. "You were incredible," he murmured, swallowing back pain. "I saw you standing against him. She shook her head, tears threatening. "I couldn't let him take me back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I couldn't." He nodded, brushing a strand of matted hair from her face. "You won't have to. Ever again." She drew in a shuddering breath, leaning her forehead against his shoulder. He held her gently, mindful of her wounds. For a moment, they simply breathed together, two battered souls who had come through fire. The canyon seemed haunted by the ghosts of the battle, silent but for the rustle of a breeze across the stone. Eventually, Helena found enough composure to speak. "What now?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The pack, Carver's death, the mate bond that she could no longer deny. Her mind spun with uncertainty. Ronan's lips brushed the top of her head, a tender gesture that made her heart twist. "We heal," he said softly. "Then we decide if we want to stay in these wilds or find somewhere new. But we decide. No one else dictates our fate." She nodded, tears slipping free. For the first time in ages, she felt the weight of fear slide from her shoulders, replaced by a fragile hope. She sensed the bond pulsing between them, not a chain of obligation, but a promise of acceptance, an understanding that each had chosen the other in defiance of the laws that once caged them. Though the path ahead remained uncharted and fraught with challenges, they had won the right to forge it together. As dawn approached, they clung to each other beneath the stony overhang, battered but unbroken. The new day's light filtered through the canyon, revealing the aftermath of violence and the quiet lull of possibility. Helena knew that scars, both physical and emotional, would linger, but she also felt the stirring of a fierce, unexpected joy. She was free, truly free, and in the arms of a rogue who had become her ally, protector, and something more. She found the courage to face whatever came next. Outside, the canyon walls bore silent witness to the turning of an era. Far beyond, the pack Carver had ruled with an iron hand would fragment, struggling to choose new leadership, or to remember the outcast who had defied them. But in that dawn-lit cleft of stone, none of it mattered. Helena and Ronan, huddled against the cold, held the future in their hands, forging a bond that no decree or battle could sever, a bond that refused to be tamed, wild and steadfast as the wilderness itself. They would rise again from the dust and blood, forging their path through these lands as they saw fit. And though the memories of heartbreak, betrayal, and violence would never fully fade, they would be tempered by the flame of a love stronger than fear, a love that had defied pack and rogue alike. That was how their story ended on that dawn, yet it was only the beginning of the life they would build, side by side, against all odds.